before, so I think that'll be fine.
Wait, I'm supposed to do... There, that's my new thing.
Awful. I hate it. Somewhere B is like cackling. Hang on. Okay. All right, I am ready to go. I'm just setting up the timer. All right. You good?
Yep.
Okay, let's do it. In 3, 2. Welcome back to Give Up After 3, a critical analysis of BBC's Sherlock, examining each episode to understand how things went so wrong that fans invented a secret final episode to justify why the show had been so bad all along. You can find show notes and sources at zeroindent.com/giveupafter3. And if you want episodes early or just want to support us, head over to patreon.com/zeroindent. I'm DC McNeil, author and editor at Zero Indent, and I'm joined, as always, by Darth. Darth, how you going?
Hello.
I wrote an intro, finally. And then I scuffed it up. I got it wrong somehow. Professional podcasting. I've only been doing this for 8 years. Jesus Christ. Welcome to episode 3. We are going to be talking about The Great Game this week, which is the conclusion of season 1. So we'll take a bit of a break after this and then come back with season 2. This episode was directed by Paul McGowan. It was written by Mark Gatiss. It originally aired on the 8th of August 2010 to approximately 8.66 million UK viewers. Content warning, this episode contains topics of self-harm, suicide, and depression. This one was adapted loosely from The Adventure of Bruce Parlington Plans and The 5 Orange Pips. It really just has a reference to The 5 Orange Pips. I wouldn't say that this is adapted in any way. Before we get to the summary, Darth, what did you think of this episode?
I didn't really have this memory going into it, but when I was rewatching it, I was like, oh, this has always been one of my favorites. And then I went through the process of trying to figure out why I would call this one of my favorites, and I think it actually just boils down to how... maybe not complicated, but there's I think 4 different solves in this one episode. Mm-hmm. So just the number of different things that are different, because normally it's like the one murder and it's one type of thing. Like in the first episode, everyone died by taking poison. There was nothing more complicated than that. But in this one, every death is unique, and so every solve is very unique, and that keeps you as an audience member much more not more involved, but it keeps you involved in a different way than in the first one. If that makes any sense. It
does. I mean, there's a bit more to actually pay attention to and pick up on as well. I think just the volume of detail in this is a lot higher, but I also think that it starts to reveal a bit, like we talked about last time. The second they try and go for too many things, you start to see the edges of what this kind of craft can achieve. And when we talked last time about aesthetics often trumping meaning or narrative utility or narrative structure, this episode in particular is probably the first biggest sin of this seems like a really cool idea and setup and will make for some cool scenes, and then is formally played as, oh no, this all made sense all along and this is structurally cohesive, and it sort of does that trick it did last time in a way that's super interesting. So I'll read us a summary and then we can get stuck right into it. So after I forgot this is how I started it. After 6 minutes of time wasting, the story starts with the building across from Baker Street blowing out. Holmes and Watson are drawn into 5 seemingly unconnected cases, starting with a pink phone in a lockbox from the exploded building. This leads Holmes and Watson to the basement of Baker Street, where they find a pair of trainers. Holmes receives a call explaining a puzzle has been laid out for him. 12 hours to solve 5 cases or another bomb goes off. After solving all 5 cases in a mind battle with the bomber, Holmes is After solving all 5 cases in a mind battle with the bomber, Holmes lures the bomber to the pool where the first case took place with top-secret military plans, only to discover John in a bomb vest. Moriarty then reveals himself as the bomber and explains that he is going to burn Sherlock's world down if he doesn't stop meddling. He lets Watson go, and at the last moment changes his mind, returning and threatening to kill Holmes and Watson. We then cut to credits. If me reading the intro and that was any indication, today is going to be a hard day for me to read words, apparently. So I really concatenated that episode down to its core. It's something that is interesting to do with a story like this because so much of the stuff in the middle, like those 5 cases, isn't necessarily filler, but it's not the plot necessarily. And I think that's a really interesting thing about this episode, is that it seems to, as you said, be structurally quite different. So let me set up the first the first scene here, which is sort of, as I said in my intro, time wasting, but I also think it's really, really important to discuss what this scene is trying to do. So Sherlock travels to Minsk to consider the case of an alleged murderer, Barry Berwick, who claims that he murdered his girlfriend by accident. Sherlock, of course, is more offended by the man's crimes against good grammar than the actual murder itself. He leaves smugly, informing Berwick that he will soon be hanged, not hung. Tell me what you thought of this scene, because I have so many notes. I have like 2 pages of notes on this.
Okay, so the funny thing is, after my 2 paragraphs that are completely bashing this scene, I realized I think what they were going for, and that it might not be as stupid as I thought, but my first sentence was, "This is one of the stupid, most unnecessary, and confusing intros I've ever seen. It doesn't establish anything important for the story, makes no sense in universe. Why would Sherlock ever meet with this man that is so obviously the killer?" And the only reason that I give this scene a pass ever is because it is one of the most beautifully shot scenes. Like, it's love
so well
watching
filmed.
this scene. It is from the lighting to the camera movement. Just everything is just gorgeous in this scene.
I'm fairly sure this episode is where they first get the aerial Alexa cameras in, and you can tell the significant jump in some of the types of shutters they're using and the quality of it. My first note is this scene is bizarre and unbearable. So, okay, if you had to guess, what do you think the scene is trying to do for the story?
So in retrospect, what I think it was supposed to do was to show that Sherlock was so bored that he was willing to go talk to someone he knew was wrong, that he knew was a criminal, just to alleviate his boredom.
Yeah, that's kind of how I read it too.
It doesn't really come across that way, though, at all.
Because we don't know he's bored before he goes there, so it's just, by the time we get he's bored in the house, we've lost all context for that first scene, right?
They could also, if that was their intention, which obviously you came to the same conclusion, so that probably was their intention, but they could have played the scene out just with the acting to make it seem that Sherlock was so bored, and if, like, for instance, if Sherlock kept pushing the topics away from the actual murder to talk about other stuff, because it's obvious, he already knows, yeah, this guy murdered his wife or his girlfriend, whatever. But if he goes and just keeps talking about other stuff, like he's trying to actively figure out what other crimes has this guy done, like, we could at least be getting a hint that he doesn't care about this, he's only here to figure out other stuff. Maybe that would have given us the hint that he's only doing this because he's bored. But regardless, yeah, it doesn't flow because it comes before the scene where we find out how bored he is. Maybe that would have fixed it. I'm
trying to think of, like, I guess I'm doing that thing where I want to try and read these scenes as they were likely, not necessarily intended, because we'll talk about antagonistic reading a little bit toward the end of this episode, but there is a sense to, I can feel that there was an idea here and it just doesn't quite come together. Like, this is trying to go for something and it never quite gets there. But I think one of the things that last time when we did this, we talked about the first scene in the previous episode for like 30 minutes, and I was like, I'm not going to do the same thing this week. Like, this is not going to happen. Like, we need to get into the meat of it. And then I finished this scene and paused and went, oh, because I think I know what this scene is trying to do at a rhetorical level, not necessarily at a plot level. So, for those who aren't watching along with us, basically, the way this scene plays out is Sherlock is asking this guy about what happened the night of the murder, and he constantly challenges this guy's grammar as he's going, and it sort of makes the guy stop and start, and then sort of he's clearly trying to antagonize him. But what's interesting is, at the end of the conversation, the prisoner gets his grammar correct right before he says the hang thing, which is just like a joke for the scene to end. Which does something interesting with the context of this world. It seems to intimate that this person, or people who speak like this, are like doing it on purpose or being willfully ignorant, because the idea here is that he knows what the correct grammar is and he's just like choosing not to use it because of his dialect, sort of thing. And whether or not Stephen Moffat thinks that of people that speak this way or thinks that of ignorant people is less interesting to me than the implications for the way this world functions, because this is also the episode where we get the homeless network introduced. And so there is something happening here at a rhetorical level, textually, where just because somebody is dumb or talks in a way that seems dumb or ignorant doesn't mean they are. They might be willfully ignorant, which I think is a really good idea to kind of bring up world building again, because we haven't really talked about world building in its formal apparatus. And for me, this scene is really critical to allowing that moment with the homeless network to feel like it makes sense subtextually. So I want to bring up this idea, which was defended by Dr. Hannah Rika Royne in her... so she wrote an essay, and then she sort of writes a response to it. And the response is imaginative, immersive, and interactive engagements, the rhetoric of world building in contemporary speculative fiction. And specifically, Royne is talking a lot about science fiction and fantasy, but I think her point stands. So I want to read you an extract from that, and then hear your thoughts about how you think this scene might impact the kind of the way that we read intelligence, and the inverse of intelligence, which is ignorance here. So quote, "In my point of view, speculative fictional world building is a double-layered process. This approach resembles science fiction scholar Darko Suvin's classic theory on the co-presence of cognition and estrangement, which allows science fiction both relevance to our world and the position to take the position to challenge the ordinary, the taken for granted. What I would like to emphasize here is that fictional domains, which are often taken to be distant from our experience of mundane reality, are actually in a deep dialogue with the userly engagement taking place in the here and now. In a sense, speculative fiction invites its users to engage with the worlds imaginatively, but also enables them to recognize the artificiality of these worlds, to reflect on the fact that they are a real-world construct made for a purpose. Consider the summer television hit Stranger Things. Its homage to the works of Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Stephen King, and the like make its constructed nature obvious, but at the same time, it enables and guides our imaginative engagement in a meaningful way." End quote. That's from Royne's paper. That was 2016, page 64. Her point, I guess, to titrate all of that is that, you know, in the same way that fantasy stories construct a literal imagined world, fiction like Sherlock constructs a imagined rhetorical world, which is to say the way these characters behave and interact and react to each other creates a consistent set of rules for like how we understand what is and isn't possible, right? We saw that a bit in the previous episode, you know, Sherlock and Raz and this underworld of graffiti artists, the Chinese smuggling syndicate, and so on. This is sort of tapping into the imagined construct of intelligence in the Sherlock world. And that's something that becomes a real central focus moving forward is, you know, intelligence and a focus on who's smart, you know, is Sherlock smarter than Mycroft and Moriarty and Irene and that sort of thing. And here we get a glimpse at the other end of the spectrum, which is ignorance. So I guess my question to you then, Darth, is if this scene is telling us something about the way that ignorance functions or the way that like the opposite of intelligence functions, what do you think that might be? And like what impact does that maybe have on how we perceive intelligence and ignorance, you know, moving forward?
Well, I guess my immediate question is, if they put that much thought into this scene, which is always a big if, is it actual ignorance or perceived ignorance? Because there seems to be some kind of like running theme so far in the show with a character being depicted as X, but then it's actually Y, because that was a big point with the cabbie. And like he had dialogue that actually said, people see me and they think I'm stupid. And then you could say the same thing about the boss lady in episode number 2, because you would not think that the boss of a crime syndicate is going to be this little tiny woman who does not look physically threatening at all. She doesn't even honestly act that threatening. It's just she's holding a gun on him. That's the only reason she's actually threatening. So you could say that they're running with this theme that they're doing the opposite of what it physically appears. However, with this character, it seems to be very much straight on. Like, you're supposed to think he's kind of an idiot, and I think that, at least my reading of the scene was that the only reason that he was actually correcting his grammar was not because he was, like you were describing, that he was falling back on he actually had a proper education or whatever. I was interpreting it as he knew what he had to say for Sherlock to help him. And he was trying to do whatever he could to get the help that he needed. Was how I was interpreting it.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess I want to touch on one point that you had there earlier, which is that when I talk about this scene constructing to that rhetorical world building, whether or not the author intended for that to be the case, anything that happens in a show, like in a world, does that, right? So like any piece of dialogue, any action is contributing to that. So this is one of the things that's interesting about the way that we as users engage with text, is that if I write a scene and I make the curtains in the scene blue, for example, that I may not have done that for any particular reason other than I just had to pick a color and I needed it, and just like, fuck it, the curtains are blue. But someone can look at that text and they can actually go, well, why did Dave make that choice? What was the underlying, intrinsic textual reason that they're blue? And it could be because, like, I come from this type of background and I associate blue with these emotions, and the scene is inherently sad. And so whether or not I've made that active choice, there is always a possibility that a reader can read a text in such a way that creates meaning. And so when we talk about this idea that Dr. Royne is defending, it is less so that authors are always making conscious choices, and more so that every choice in a text has an outcome. And that outcome changes the way that we read the rest of the text. So, like, for example, what this seems to me to imply is that if someone is foolish or stupid in the world of Sherlock, it's somehow of their own doing. In the same way that we saw that evil defeats itself in the previous 2 episodes, so too does ignorance seem to, like, self-perpetuate. And I think critically, touching on your point there, per Dr. Royne, quote, "World-building in speculative fiction not only engages the user in imagining fictional characters, events, and such, but also in a more rational process of making comparison between actual outcomes and possible events." End quote. And that's really the key thing, which is not necessarily that in putting this character in, Moffat is trying to make a statement about intelligence, or Gatiss, or whoever wrote the scene. It's that in having an ignorant person behave this way and react to Sherlock correcting their grammar in this way, there is some rational process where we then, if we see someone who seems to be ignorant or talking in this particular effective dialogue, we are going to expect a different outcome and make comparisons between that previous instance of it. And so when we talk about the predicting cause and effect, these are crime stories, they're detective stories. It's really important that we often start with an outcome, which is like a body, and then we work backwards to a cause. And so similarly, in studying fiction like this, we have to observe the way that these incidental pieces of rhetorical world building teach us how to read the text and understand and predict it. Because the way that this is what's unique about fiction, is fiction teaches you how to interpret it as you read it. And so the way the prisoner speaks, and the way that Sherlock treats it, and the way that the camera and the framing and the dialogue reacts to his treatment of that, is consistent with the text treatment of intelligence and ignorance so far, and then continues to layer onto that. And so next time we see hyperintelligence or hyperignorance, we're going to then be interpreting it slightly differently. And so it's just, I think, as a piece of formal apparatus, it's something the show is going to start to do an awful lot, where it's going to re-pick up these ideas of intelligence and perception, like you said, and perception of intelligence, and just continually examine those, whether it's through the lens of like Mycroft, or we end up getting Irene Adler in particular, who becomes a real focal point of that. In fact, as you say, representation and perception becomes critical with characters like Mary, Moriarty, and later on Euros and things like that. So it's certainly seems to be a focal theme of the show. And to what extent this scene works or not, I think it's just worth doting on at the top here, because it is the thing this show seems to be most interested in. It's something that comes up a lot in Steve's work as well. So yeah, there you go. I hit pause, and that all just was like, oh my god, I've suddenly realized what they're trying to, what is happening here at a formal level. So, yes. Anything else on that first scene, or should we get into the actual story?
Well, I was sitting here while you were talking, trying to think about the other characters that could fit into that, and I was trying to remember some of the dialogue of the bike messenger from later on in this episode, and see how much he fit into that. See how much those kind of like brutish characters who are portrayed as being slightly stupid, big, muscular brutes, and if he used, lower level, language. But that would be something interesting to look forward to in the rest of these episodes, as we're coming and see, did they tick that box every time going forward?
Yeah. How does that change and evolve as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so I'll set up the introduction to our actual plot finally, which comes like a good 6 minutes into the episode. So at 221B Baker Street, a bored Sherlock is reduced to shooting holes in the wall. When John comes in, he discovers a decapitated head in the fridge, one of Sherlock's experiments. Sherlock is angry that his account on their first case on the blog has made him ridiculous by revealing that he doesn't know primary school levels of astronomy. Sherlock is of the opinion that any knowledge not likely to have any importance to his work takes up precious space in his brain. John goes out and Mrs. Hudson comes in. She sympathizes with Sherlock's disgust of a boring life and assures him that no doubt there'll be a murder to investigate soon. As she leaves, an explosion rocks the building across the street, shattering the windows behind Sherlock. Thoughts on a smarmy Sherlock being a smarmy baby boy, a little baby boy, the little smarmy baby boy.
There were a couple of really interesting things that I did not notice until rewatching this scene. Number one, the shooting of the gun had a couple of, like, interesting points. One, we haven't, I don't think, seen Sherlock even holding a gun as it's only episode 3 in the series, but still, we hadn't seen it so far, and we ended up seeing it 3 times in just this one episode. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if they were, like, actively saying, like, okay, we want him to be more action-packed in this episode, so, but to go from never holding a gun to now we've got 3 different times at least is interesting. But the drama queen moment that he had was, if you listen for it, you hear the door shut, the front door, then Sherlock starts firing the gun into the wall. Because he wants John to hear him and wants to start a row with John because he's a drama queen.
Yes.
So theoretically he had been shooting the gun before that, but just the knowledge that he waited until John was home to do it was just hilarious to me. And then the shot of the head in the fridge was so interesting from a cinematography perspective because the director of photography, almost every single one, would do a jump scare for that shot. They would show a behind-the-back shot of John opening the fridge, then they would show a POV shot of the head inside there with a big sound effect to scare the audience. They did the exact opposite. They did a wide shot for the whole entire thing. We just get a glimpse of the head inside before John slams the door shut. It does not even cut to a reverse shot to get John's expression. It just stays on his hunched back while you see him, like, hold his head in his hands. It is such a conserved way of doing this scene, and there's just beauty in how simple they tend to shoot these things.
Yeah. This scene in particular starts off very smartly utilitarian in its filmmaking, gets a little silly toward the end, and then by next season, because I ended up watching the first few minutes of the first episode of next season, boy, it gets silly real quick, and they just go off the deep end, and then they start to just, like, I mean, their budget skyrockets, right? That's the other thing that happens next season. But yeah, this is a really, like, so Sherlock is very annoying in this scene in a way that, like, works quite well for what they're going for. I also like the idea that John doesn't rise to his bait necessarily. He just kind of ends up disengaging and leaving, unlike later where he does, take the bait when they have their second little argument. So I think it works really well. It's a little bit cartoonish, but I think it works fine for the tone of what we're dealing with.
It's also kind of interesting just to think in universe, like, the stuff that Sherlock does to teach himself and to train himself. Like, he's identified 42 different kinds of pipe tobacco, right? Like, all of these little things, like, needed time to do. He's not going to do that in the middle of a case, so that would be in his downtime. So theoretically, he does not get bored because there's always more to learn. So it's really interesting to think that either A, they are telling us that there has been so much downtime that there's nothing else to learn, or B, I don't know. I can't.
There's the seeming implication by the end of this episode, once we work out what's going on, is that there hasn't been a great deal of murder or crime because Moriarty's been busy planning all of this nonsense. And he's the guy who coaches all the people doing the crimes. And so there's a reading that, and when we, and this is in this episode, I'm going to introduce you to a few key Tumblr blogs that were covering this stuff at the time, because I think the historical contextualization is important to understand this text. When we talk about that, one of the things that's happening is people are going through these episodes and finding explanations for this stuff in the text, and then arguing their explanations with each other against other explanations. And so what we're going to start to see, and I'll talk about it a little bit toward the end of the episode. Actually, I'll talk about it a lot at the end of the episode, if being honest. I have like 4 pages on it. We're going to start to see things like, how could Sherlock possibly be bored, becomes a, here is a 10-page essay that I've written on my Tumblr blog in response to your 20-page essay, in response to another 5-page essay. And so people are going to start to find reasons that don't exist. They're going to undertake antagonistic readings of the text where they deliberately misinterpret the author's intent in order to make their readings work. It becomes a fascinating exercise. Because the short answer is like, you know, he should be bored doing some fucking wacky experiments, man. That's what we see in the Warner Brothers Sherlock Holmes with Robert Downey Jr., where, you know, when he's bored, he gets drunk and goes brawling to win money, and then does weird, unnecessary experiments with bugs with a violin, right? And so in his downtime, he just gets overly obsessive about research. This Sherlock just becomes a smarmy baby boy who just wants to fight with his little baby friend John. And it's, you know, it's a different contextualization. It's a different characterization. I think it's probably the easier option from a writing perspective. This is shorthand. It's a very get out of jail free card for having to think too hard about what Sherlock's been doing at his time. Also, I just think this whole first 6 minutes is like just complete filler. There was no need for Sherlock to be bored. This literally could have started with they're in the flat doing something and the explosion happens. There is no reason why the prior 6 minutes are important to this at all, except to say that Sherlock is waiting for something more interesting to happen, which you could have gotten away with a single line of dialogue when they walk in and he's like, man, we solved another murder. Too bad it was too straightforward. I'm getting kind of bored. And then boom, it explodes. You know, there is this feels indulgent in a sense. It feels like, here are our characters chewing the scenery. Look at how good the chemistry is between Holmes and Watson. There's a certain lack of utility here, which I think is going to become the show's defining characteristic.
I mean, the one reading that could make it really important is that he was so bored because John had been on dates with Mary for the past several nights or something like that. And so it could really emphasize that he's becoming really dependent on John, but we don't get any of that as the backstory. So really, the only part of these first 6 minutes was because constantly throughout the episode, he says, this evil genius must be bored. And then I think Moriarty even says it at some point later on. So, like, that's the point of this first 6 minutes, is to establish if Sherlock is bored, then his nemesis must be bored too.
Correct. Which is not important to either of their characterization. It's like, this doesn't add... I mean, yeah, anyway, we can't... I think we should talk about it when we talk about that scene with Moriarty at the end, because I got a lot in that. But to your point... so the next morning, John wakes up at Dr. Sarah Sawyer's flat, where he spent the night on the couch. They watch a newscast, and John spots a piece about an explosion, the one that occurred across Baker Street. He rushes back to the apartment and discovers Sherlock and his brother Mycroft sitting in the living room, unaffected by what seems like a staged gas leak. Mycroft tries to persuade his brother to look into the murder of an MI6 employee, Andrew West, who was found in a rail yard in Battersea adjacent to a switch, with his head smashed and missing a USB stick which had been in his custody. Mycroft explains that the flash drive contained vital information about the Bruce Parlington missile project. Sherlock refuses to take the case, claiming he's super busy with all of his interesting cases. He eventually ends up asking John to investigate this himself. What do you think about this? I had no notes on this. I just thought this was a perfectly fine scene. Him being smarmy to his brother maybe undoes a bit of the work they've done with the boredom, but I mean, I think it's fine.
Yeah, I just don't understand it.
Yeah.
Like, I know that I've said like 15 times already in these past 3 episodes that he's a drama queen unnecessarily so many times, but that is literally the only reason he pretended that he wasn't going to take the case. But then he also pretended he wasn't going to take it with John, So he's double pretending just for the drama, and it just does not make sense, even from a writing perspective, unless you just really like drama, so you're going to put it into your stuff.
I think it's that they really like. I think it's that they really like these characters being mean to each other for no reason. Like I legitimately, yeah.
Someone watched Mean Girls too many times growing up, and
Listen, Mean Girls is a great film. But the thing about Mean Girls is that characters have authentic moments of connection with each other. Even the characters who are like framed as, that fake antagonism, right? That starts to develop. You still have these characters who have genuine connections and moments of like actual authenticity. This show, I think, struggles with, and we talked about it a bit last time, but this scene is cool because they get to bounce off each other in interesting ways, but there's no reason for them to be bouncing off each other. It's just the fact that it's aesthetically cool to watch, and it has that snappy like back and forth and that kind of wet and speak that we talked about in episode 1. Like, this is pure aesthetic, this scene. There's no motivation behind it, and this is maybe a harbinger of some stuff to come. This episode somehow escapes it with what happens next, but like, I think we should keep an eye on how often that occurs with different scenes, where it's purely because it'll be cool to have these two characters do that thing and talk to each other in that way.
One interesting thing that just popped into my head was the solve that both of the brothers do as to John being on the sofa and not the Lilo. At first, it was bugging me because it's the same thing we've been saying, where they're omniscient and they're seeing things we can't see, but thinking about it, you visibly see both of their eyes go down to John's ankles, and then I was thinking about it, and I was like, if he had his legs hanging off the couch, he might have had a crease form on his pant legs, and then combine that with a crick in his neck, and then you get a rough size of what he was sleeping on. So then I'm like, oh, that solve wasn't as
It's less outlandish.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank goodness, because all the other souls in this episode are complete bullshit. So, shortly after this, Deputy Inspector Greg Lestrade calls Sherlock to Scotland Yard. There, Sherlock is given a package containing a replica of the pink mobile phone from Jennifer Wilson, the murder victim of A Study in Pink. This phone came from a lockbox in the exploded building, like we said in the summary. A message on the phone plays 5 Greenwich pips and displays a photo of a rundown basement, which he recognizes as 221C Baker Street, the basement flat of his building. Sherlock, John, and Lestrade go back to 221C and find a pair of trainers lying in the middle of the room. At that point, Sherlock receives a blocked phone call from a terrified woman in her parked car who is reading a message that she is obviously being sent by somebody else. She urges Sherlock to solve the puzzle in 12 hours or the explosive vest she's wearing will be detonated. Sherlock believes the 5 pips mean that he will be required to solve 5 challenges. Now, Darth, you're a big-time American gunman. Do you know what a Greenwich pip is?
After this episode, and I had to look it up. Yeah.
Did you Wikipedia it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Per Wikipedia, the Greenwich Pips were a series of 6 short tones broadcasted at 1-second intervals at the top of the hour on BBC radio stations. They were introduced in 1924 and have been generated by the BBC since 1990. To mark the precise start of each hour, their utility and calibration is diminishing as digital broadcasting entails time lags by default. I should explain where this comes from, because this is my Moffat moment for the episode as well. It's both. So there's actually, my Moffat moment is both the 221C part and then also the pips. Because 221C is like Moffat being like, bet you didn't think there was a flat below them. Bet you didn't notice they were walking upstairs, you fucking rube. And I'm like, no, I did. Like, it's B-A-B-C. Like, I did. And he's like, no, but you didn't because you didn't think about it. They're going upstairs. What's beneath that? Oh. It's very, like, fuck off, Steven. The other thing, so the Greenwich Pips, there's supposed to be 6 with the final one in the hour. They use these to count down instead of count up. The other thing that's happening here is that the phone only plays 5 pips, 5 cases. In theory, the final pip should be like the final case, but there isn't one. This is also a reference to the 5 orange pips, which is the most Moffat thing ever. So the 5 orange pips is kind of this like little detail in that story. It's where the story gets its title from, however, where 5 orange seeds are enclosed in this envelope as part of a threat to this kernel. And the threat is kind of what like kicks off the story and becomes Sherlock's central solve, is like who would recognize the 5 orange pips as a threat. And it becomes a really central part of that. And so there's this thing happening here where this is clever because in that story, it's counting, in that story and in real life, the Greenwich pips count upward, the 5 orange pips count downward, and here the Greenwich pips count downward. So it's a level of like cleverness, because if you know what the Greenwich pips mean and you remember, you know the original story, you've worked out before Sherlock says it that it's actually counting backwards. And so it's very like metatextually a smart guy thing to put in your story. Kind of sucks to watch though, because it doesn't mean anything. It's just like, okay, it's counting down. Didn't have to be Greenwich pips. Could have just been someone saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know what I mean? Like this doesn't add anything. It's just obtuse for the sake of it. But yeah, bad touch, Steve. Don't like it. Okay, so other thing I noticed, the phone. You know, there's about 4 lines where it's like, you know, is that the phone? No, that's not the phone. But someone's gone to great detail to make it look exactly like they bought a pink phone case. That's not a lot of work. Like, I was trying to work out, like, what detail is he seeing that we're not? And there just isn't one.
The only one that I'm almost positive that they actually scratched up the charging port to match that, because it was supposed to be scratched on the original. But it's odd because they should have focused on that. The camera should have focused on the scratch charging port, because when they said that, I'm pretty sure they were actually focusing on the audio 3.5 jack, which just
weird,
doesn't...
man. I didn't. Yeah, because the camera kept doing close-ups. I'm like, what are they seeing that I'm not seeing? Like, it was just, I don't know. It seemed like an unnecessary detail. They could have just been like, it's a replica. Like, I don't know. The dialogue just needed a slight tweak there, I think.
Well, the really interesting thing to me, and this was kind of like an overall note for the entire episode, because I just felt so weird that this episode treats Sherlock as nostalgic. And the entire point was like, oh, is that the pink phone? The pink phone? The one we've heard about for 25 years? No, it's been 2 episodes. I mean, this is not nostalgia when it happened like 2 weeks ago. Like, how long? We don't know what the time frame is, but still, it's like... It feels like that should have happened in like season 3 or something.
Yes.
Like, if you're gonna make it a callback, it's got to be a call back, not a call. Oh, that just happened. Yeah,
you have to earn it. Yeah.
And
I
I
agree. That is weird.
Yeah, like this entire thing felt so weird. I mean, yes, you could say that Moriarty's been following him for a lot longer than this, but if you're gonna make it a nostalgia trip, then let's do it later and figure out some other way. Anyway, that... It
also feels like blowing that cool reveal, which is... Because that phone is really recognizable. If you'd done that in season 3, we would have been like, oh shit, I remember that. Like, that's crazy. But here you just go, okay, it's the phone. All right.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I guess, so the reason it's the phone is because John has started publicizing, he's written up that case properly. And that's what gets Moriarty's attention finally, for him to start, getting involved and stuff like that. And to start antagonizing Sherlock. And so I think the idea textually here is that the reason it's the pink phone is that John started publicizing it, which has drawn Moriarty's attention, which then becomes the method, which we'll see later, for Moriarty to go after Sherlock and Watson. And so I think it's sort of, it's ruining what is a potentially cool payoff and reveal later for a setup for something that's not going to happen yet. And that's a very Moffat structural move, which is, here's a cool thing that I could hold on to later. If I just held on to it later, it could be really effective. Instead, I'm going to blow it now and set up something that is less effective because I think it'll be cooler. It's a real deflationary movement, which we see a lot here in this style of structural storytelling. So we then kind of get...
Hold on, I had a funny note before you move on from that scene. There were at least twice in this episode where I found that I had to turn on the subtitles because I could not tell what Sherlock was saying. and I don't remember having this big of a problem in the first two.
Oh, the sound mixing in this episode is terrible.
I couldn't figure out if it was that, or if it was just that they keep having Sherlock have these moments of realization, and then he just goes off and does it quietly.
Why do you think
So
they didn't?
sud-
They just didn't mix
I
it
don't know.
properly. There's some stuff in which this is so loud and stuff that's so quiet. I was like, what the? Did you guys just know what happened?
But so I actually had to go out to the internet and find a copy of the script, because I was watching this on a copy that didn't have subtitles on it, because at this point, when the realization comes that a villain has put all this together for him, and he emphatically goes, "The curtain rises." And I'm sitting here Googling, "the cat has rice." The cat... And I'm like, the cat and
You're like,
mouses.
is that
like,
an
and I'm
English
like-
saying? I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm like, is he referring to an old case of his?
Is-
Like, is this a British saying that I don't
That's
understand?
very funny.
And so I legit spent 10 minutes trying to figure out about the cat and the rice and the mouse, and then I finally find this point in the script, and the curtain rises. Oh, that was stupid for me to waste this much time.
Yeah,
trying to figure
it was nothing in the end. Incredible. That's going to be a real hallmark of this series, is us investing way too much time into something that ends up being nothing. Okay, yeah, that's very good. We should just say up the top here. I noticed this. I noticed, like, for the first time, the audio in this episode was mixed really poorly. Like, I had to constantly adjust the volume as I was watching it my second time. For those who might have said this in the first episode, my process for this show is I watch the episode and then I do all my research, and then I watch it a second time and take notes as I go based on that research. And the second time, I literally sat there like with the speaker in front of me and had to adjust the volume multiple times throughout, because there were moments where it was too loud and then too quiet. Like, it was weird. I just don't think they equalized it. They get better at that over time, but man, there's a few scenes where the music is so loud you can barely hear the dialogue, and it's not in a way that's like a Nolan, like, I'm doing it on purpose type thing. It was clearly a mistake. Okay, so case number 1, Carl Powers. I'm going to set up this. So the way that we're going to do these cases is I'm going to set up the whole case, and then we're going to talk it through. It seemed like the simplest way to structure this. In my original beat sheet, I had done it differently, and then I restructured it, and I was like, okay, just by cases, it's fine. So, case number 1, Carl Powers. So Sherlock and John go to St. Bart's lab to examine the trainers. They are interrupted by Molly Hooper. She is hoping to make Sherlock jealous by introducing him to her new boyfriend, Jim, an IT guy, who is impressed with Sherlock based on what Molly has told him. Sherlock immediately informs her that Jim is gay, pointing out his meticulous self-grooming, exposed underwear, and most importantly, the telephone number he left under Sherlock's petri dish. Once Molly leaves, Sherlock invites John to examine the trainers, insisting he can use a second opinion. John begins examining them, deducing they belong to a child with large feet. Sherlock congratulates him, but notes he missed almost everything important. He explains the shoes are 20 years old, but well kept, and the mud and pollen on them indicate they came from Sussex. Sherlock very quickly realizes the shoes belong to a young schoolboy named Carl Powers, an athlete who came to London from Brighton for a swimming competition and drowned in 1989 in what seemed like a tragic accident. The case had attracted Sherlock's attention at the time because the victim's shoes were not present with the rest of his belongings. However, Sherlock was underage and unable to get the police to open an investigation or pay attention. Now he's able to solve it from the clues left on the trainers. Carl Powers had been poisoned with Clostridium botulinum via his eczema medication. He applied this cream to his feet, and that's why his shoes were taken, as they contain the only evidence of the murder. He posts the results on the website, and the booby-trapped woman is freed by the bomb squad. Subsequently, John meets with Mycroft to collect more facts about the missile plans. Mycroft tells him the dead man was an MI6 clerk involved in the project in a minor capacity, last seen with his fiancée Lucy the previous night. He was found at Battersea, his skull bashed in, but he did not have a ticket or a used Oyster card, suggesting he didn't ride the train. John lies and insists that Sherlock is completely and utterly focused on the case. So, as you said, nostalgia becomes a focus here. We get one of Sherlock's earliest cases. I think the idea of him returning to it is kind of cool. I think it suggests a lot about the bomber and his knowledge of Sherlock. We start to go, hey, what's going on here? How does he know that Sherlock was interested in this case? I also really like John doing his little piece of deduction on the shoes. It's probably about as it's about as good as and realistic as the kind of deduction that we as real people could probably have done. And it's one of the last times that the show goes out of its way to have this stuff make sense, I would say. This is really, in my opinion, like one of the last sort of us being able to, as the, through the point of view character John, solve this stuff without Sherlock. We don't have some of the extra detail, but we could have got to Sherlock solve with the information John provides us, which I think is cool. What do you think about this little case here?
I have quite a few notes about this first one. And one of them is that my internet search history now has the phrase, does showing your underwear actually indicate you're gay? Because I do not understand where they pulled that from. I have never in my life heard that.
Uh-huh. What did you discover?
The internet doesn't know. I don't know. I don't think know where the creators. I don't know where they got that from.
There was. I don't. So I think this is another Sherlock. I think this is another Moffat moment, to be completely honest with you, which is in the olden times, the way that you could self-identify as being gay was having a handkerchief in your back pocket that was exposed. And so I think it's Moffat, because I believe that's a clue in one of the original Sherlock stories that he uses to make a deduction. I think this is Moffat doing a Moffat smart guy reference thing, if I had to guess. I'm not entirely sure. That's the closest I could come to reasoning this out. Other than Stephen Moffat definitely does not understand gay people at all, is the other thing, which is also true here.
The funny thing was that I took it as gospel for the past like 10 years or whenever I first saw this episode, and I was like, okay, I guess I don't want to leave my underwear showing because that sends the wrong signals. And now I'm learning it doesn't.
You're like, no, he just made that up because he doesn't know anything about anyone. It's fucking ridiculous. It's also, like we talked about last episode, it's that gay people are a type of guy. When we talked about a type of guy last episode, which is like, related to Goblin Theory, this is like gay people are all a type of guy. All gay men do these things because they're all a type of guy. And it's very much in that mode of Sherlock has categorized people through like a dichotomous key style, like, are they well groomed? Yes or no? If yes, is their underwear available? Yes, showing. If no, then like it's this, his brain is this weird like dichotomous key of how the world works. It couldn't simply be that this man is just well groomed, which is, it's also kind of, it's a little bit homophobic. Tiny, it's a little bit. I'm like, yeah, but like straight guys can be well groomed too. You guys like Moffat and Gatiss are like the guys who have these smart, sexy, well-groomed twink boys with their cool haircuts and their hair gel and stuff. That's all their protagonists. They are like so well-groomed. There's never a fucking hair on these guys' faces. They're always perfectly shaven. It's like, what are you talking about? Your characters are so well-groomed that it's unbelievable. And you're like, this guy dyes his eyelashes, so he must be gay. What do you... Fuck off. Fucking ridiculous.
Yep, well, aside from... Like, they could have actually done some stuff for that solve that would have been... Because, like, as soon as he sees the IT guy walk in, he could have seen, oh, yeah, his pupils dilated when he looked at me. And
yep.
They could have done something else that would have made a little bit more sense. They could have gone into, like, the psychology of the way that he stood, the way he moved his arms, the way he clasped his hands together. There's all kinds of different stuff. If he plays with his hair, granted, these are all signs I've heard from, when women like someone, they'll play with their hair, they'll touch their whatever. Assumedly those would apply to guys in certain situations, but still there's all kinds of stuff that they could have done that would have made way more sense than he washes his hair and uses hair gel, and it's just so basic. And it's not just like Sherlock stereotyping different cliques of people. It's the writers are firmly stereotyping cliques of people, which is just so odd. But anyway, so one really interesting thing that did not jump out to me until this review was this scene opens with a bit of dialogue, which is where Sherlock is asserting to John that the people don't matter. And while it's a very obvious point of this episode that Sherlock doesn't need to care about them in order to save them, and but that's not what actually I was thinking of when I was hearing this. It was, he never has the cops try to research the people. He never has the cops go out and say, is there any connection between this person, and this person? And it's like, saying that the people don't matter takes away data that could help you solve the case. So it's like they're making him so fixated on the criminal that he's leaving out all of this other information because he thinks it doesn't matter. And that just rang really, really odd to me. To say that the victim doesn't matter, at least at this stage, because later on he's like, go investigate the dead security guys, go investigate his home and see if you could find any clues there. So what, all of a sudden now the victims matter? Because you just said in this first one that the victims don't matter.
It's also a dumb rhetoric for a detective. Like, the victim is the main thing that you investigate, because that leads you back to the killer. Like, that's how I don't know, every detective story works, right? Yeah. It's just weird, man. And it's especially after a study in Pink, where the whole focus is how are these victims connected. Like, it doesn't even make sense in the coherence of this world either.
Yeah. And something else interesting that he did was he made so many assumptions about how smart the villain was. And he makes all of these assumptions right off the bat when they don't have anything to go off of as of yet. So he says, oh, the criminal is too smart. We cannot trace the phone call. It's like,
you should still try, though. You should still try.
Yeah, and like at this point, they know nothing aside from that he had a bomb and he left shoes. Oh, no one can break into a flat and leave shoes.
That simply couldn't be done.
Yeah, so I'm like, and this happens like multiple times in a couple different spots in this, where he just assumes that this villain is too smart, so he doesn't do like really basic detective stuff.
Huh. I hadn't even noticed that. Yeah, there's just like an absolute absence of like doing the basics, which is the first thing that other Sherlock, like book Sherlock, always does. And that's often where he finds the most amount of data, because he'll do the same thing that the police did, but because he's looking for the right stuff, he'll notice all of the important information. And that's the whole point. Like, that's the whole red hot core of like what makes Sherlock stories interesting is, I've said this before in episode 1, but like the idea that you could notice all of this if only you had the right perspective and you had the right research. And so we're not doing the basics. We're never given that opportunity to either follow along with him and do the basics with him, or get the sense that this is even possible. And it's just disappointing more than anything, I guess. Yeah.
So another thing in this scene was that this is yet another instance that is characterizing Sherlock as being lazy, and this is the worst one yet, where he literally makes John pull a phone out of his pocket that he's wearing the coat, and he's like, "Give me my phone."
Yeah,
like, I can't take my hands off the microscope.
Why did he do that? What was the I
think the point I've said before that he is supposed to be so deep into what he's doing that he can't be deigned to go and do the menial tasks of picking up and answering phones and stuff. So he has got his hands on the microscope and he's zeroed in on what he's doing, and he's like, "John, come answer my phone. It's in my pocket. You're gonna have to root around in there." Like, it's silly. I get what they're going for. I don't know if I could support what they're going for because it's silly.
Yeah, do you think that, like, so this is a characterization that they seem really invested in for this particular Sherlock, right? They're putting a lot of effort into being, there's he gets, the police laugh at him for not knowing about the Earth going around the sun and stuff. There's a ton of investment made here in this Sherlock only puts his focus and attention on things that he deems to be important. And I wonder, I wonder if this is something that is going to come up later in a meaningful way or not, or if this is just something Stephen and Mark think is a cool thing smart people do. Like, I just want to keep an eye on this and see if it goes anywhere, because I'm curious to see if they do anything with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to think that the writers just see this as a quirk of Sherlock's, and there's not going to be anything really deeper about it. But it's interesting to keep an eye on. The introduction of, spoiler alert, but the IT guy is Moriarty. So if anyone hasn't seen the episode,
yes.
But I am just struck by the fact that he had to have worked there at least for a couple weeks. like legitimately worked there.
Been an IT
in
guy.
order to in order to sell the idea to Molly that he worked there. In order for them to have an office relationship, he would have to be in the office.
It's weird.
So
it's weird, man.
I like the idea that a villain is so like messed up that he would do that kind of stuff, because that's interesting that you would go through this much effort, after your nemesis and he doesn't even know it's you. But Moriarty makes such a big point later on that he does not put himself out there, that he's behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they have to die at the end, because he's like, you know what's going on. You have seen me. People can't see me. That's
so
why
is
the
Molly.
Yeah. So it's like, not just her, but think about every single person that works at that building that has seen him, that knows his name, because he used his real freaking name. It says it on his ID tag as his employee check-in information.
Ridiculous.
So I don't understand from like in the world why his character would do that, because it doesn't do anything important. It's just a drama queen moment for him.
So there's something about Moriarty's characterization, which I'll get into the formal theory behind it, but there is something about him where they can explain away any of his behavior like this by simply saying he's crazy and unpredictable. He's just crazy. Sometimes it's just crazy stuff. You can't predict what Moriarty's going to do. And so anytime that you try and bring scrutiny to his behavior, there is this natural deflationary mechanism built in, which says, well, you can't criticize it for not making sense because he doesn't always do stuff that makes sense. He's crazy. You'll never know what he'll do next. And it inoculates the text from having to have his character make sense, is I think what they're trying to do here.
But that also feels like it is a very common lazy fallback for a writer, because they've done the same thing with Sherlock. There's so many things they don't care to explain because they don't need to, because they know that Sherlock is off balance and will do weird stuff, so they don't have to fully explain why he's doing weird stuff.
Yes, but the thing that they believe to be engaging and interesting, which proves to be right, this is why people watch the show, is watching these actors perform that way and do those offbeat weird things. That's the engagement that people like. They like these characterizations. They like speculating behind why did he do that thing that made no sense. And the fact that it doesn't make sense is self-perpetuating bias that the show is actually smarter than you think it is, because you have to figure it out, because that's what the creators are constantly saying about it. They're like, there's more going on here than you see. There's going to be all these reveals and rug pulls and stuff. And so it's naturally self-deflationary to avoid criticism, but it also perpetuates the mechanism by which this show becomes popular, which is theory crafting and speculation. Because if something doesn't make sense textually, and you tell the audience it actually does make sense, you just haven't worked it out yet, it encourages that kind of fan engagement, and that kind of in particular, this era, 2010, 2012, this era of Tumblr engagement with text by teens, Doctor Who is experiencing something similar. So is Sherlock, so is Supernatural. And so in having things inherently not be logical and have characters that can escape logic through their definition and through like the textual characterization, you can kind of keep this loop going, where if something doesn't make sense, the show can dismiss it by saying, but that character doesn't need to be logical. They have their own means here, but I promise they have a motive behind it. You just haven't worked it out yet. And so it kind of keeps doing this forever. Is I think that's at least formally what's happening. The problem is it sucks to watch, because you're like, but that doesn't, why would he do that now? Because we're not in that mode of reading. We're not in that mode of user engagement that Dr. Rowan refers to, which is that mode of userly engagement where you're trying to speculate about why this fiction makes sense, because we ultimately know where it all goes, right? We are informed by knowing where this show ends and what happens to the audience and their expectations and reading of it, such that we can't ourselves be engaged in that same mode. And so I think one of the challenges we're going to have, and this is why I've done so much research about people online at the time and what they were saying, like one of the staples moving forward of the show is going to become a few key Tumblr blogs and how they're talking about it. I think it's important for that historical context to understand why the show is written the way it is, because it is responding to that mode of user engagement to the point where by season 3, it literally creates a group of characters in the text that are speculating about what happened to Sherlock, that represent the audience, and they represent the different audience perspectives. And so the show becomes self-reflective of that user engagement. And those users then engage with that reflection of the user engagement and craft theories around that. And it becomes this sort of interesting cycle where sort of by the end of it, it really hems in Moffat and Gatiss into what they can actually do with this story in a way that is really compelling to me. Like this puts them in such a position by the end of this show that they cannot execute on a finale that makes any sense, because they have so many twists to wind and unwind because of this mode of engagement that nothing makes sense by the end. And so I think you touching on that idea of like thinking about Jim doing this, thinking about Moriarty undertaking this activity, the second you do that, you run into that problem and you start to see the little beginnings of where that aesthetic begins to take over the meaning and the structural requirements of a story. Like a story has to usually either make logical or emotional sense to its reader. So if it makes emotional sense, think of like Tarkovsky, think of Annihilation, for example. If it makes emotional sense, it doesn't need to make logical sense. But if it makes, but it has to usually be one or the other for it to be satisfying. And Sherlock is ultimately a lot of the times neither. And this is you can see the start of that with this behavior from someone like Moriarty. Just to extrapolate that thought into a lot of the literary theory, which we're going to get into at the end of this episode. So yeah, I think to answer your question, I think that is why the show feels no need for Moriarty's behavior there to make sense.
Gotcha. So the last note I had about like in the Carl Powers section was kind of like looking at the realism of that very first solve that Sherlock did when he was a kid, because would the newspapers really have printed details about Carl Powers' clothes and missing his shoes? Like they put that in the obit.
It's weird, man. Yeah,
I'm still trying to wrap my brain around that, and then the fact that Moriarty had to recover the shoes from the scene because they still had traces of the poison on them. At least that's how they explained it.
Well, so, yeah, the idea is that the eczema cream would have contained traces of that poison.
So why not kill him in a different way that would not leave the evidence that you have to have someone go to a busy pool where there are cops running around because someone just died in order to steal that kid's shoes? Like the number of things that don't make sense for how that entire thing went down. And then like I can't figure out if Moriarty heard about this like 20 years ago or whenever. Did he somehow hear that Sherlock was trying to solve that case? Because it said Sherlock called the cops, but they wouldn't listen to him. But then it seems like Moriarty knew that Sherlock had called the cops and they didn't listen to him.
No, I read that. I read that as he would have written about this on his website, kind of thing. Like in retrospect. But yeah.
He never wrote on. Wait, Sherlock never had. Did he? No,
he's got a website.
So he did have his own stuff.
Yeah, so I assume he was writing about that.
Okay, that's an explanation I could be okay with.
That's the implication. Yeah,
we just never see it, so it's purely.
I guess the reason I made that connection is that Moriarty is responding to Sherlock making posts on that website throughout the episode, right? And so I assume that that's how he came to this knowledge.
Okay. That makes sense. I could not figure out if Moriarty did the Carl Powers case as the first one because it was Moriarty's first one, or because it was Sherlock's first. I couldn't tell if there was supposed to be a connection.
Oh,
or if they were completely accidentally connected.
I think likely completely accidentally connected. But the suggestion seems to be that their fates have been intertwined for a lot longer than we imagined, I guess. Which, is cool, but does the thing that we spoke about in the first episode, which is it has this accidental tendency to make the world start to feel kind of small, because like everything is about Sherlock and Moriarty, sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else on this first case?
The only other thing was not directly related to the case, but during this time is when John is like actually assigned the missing missile plans case, and he goes to talk with Mycroft about it. And I can't wrap my mind around why John attempted to lie to Mycroft's face. Like it.
Yeah. I also because Mycroft would know he's lying, right?
Yeah. And John knows that Mycroft sees everything and is just as smart as Sherlock is. So it's like, and I don't know if this goes back to the ignorance talk from before, but it seems like John pretty frequently is just willfully ignorant to how smart these guys are. Because there are multiple times when he tries to lie to Sherlock when he already knows from previous experience that he can't lie to Sherlock. So
yeah, it's a good point. Does it? So there's a thing in another show which is Lie to Me, which is a really brilliant show if you haven't seen it. It's sort of a show where this character who studies like the art of lying or the science of lying. And one of the things that becomes a really central focus of that is the people really close to him in his life are constantly being like, Cal, don't read me like that. You've agreed not to read me. Like you need to let me be able to lie to you. That's part of a healthy relationship. And so it seems like John refuses to be penned into they're smart and they'll figure it out, therefore I need to be truthful. I wonder if it's trying to do something with that, but I'm not sure that's in the text. I know the contemporary other stories happening at the time have a bit of that in it.
See, the way that he plays it, though, he and I may be reading too much into this, but the way that the actor plays it, it's almost like he is ignorant and not aware. Like, if you are aware you're lying, you will do certain things. You will maintain direct eye contact. You will try not to blink, blah, blah, blah. But he does all of the opposite things. He'll shift his eyes around. He'll blink profusely. He'll put his hand over his mouth. So it is like the filmmakers are purposefully saying he's not trying to hide the fact that he's lying. And I don't know. Like, I keep coming back if this is part of that ignorance thing like you were talking about before. So we'll just have to keep looking every time John attempts to lie and see, like, why is he doing it? Does it make sense?
and then we should also keep in mind that and then in the previous episode, Sherlock constantly lying about being in a fight. There's something happening here in the text. Like, this is something that is happening between these characters, and I don't know what yet.
Well, at the same time, the main characters lying to each other and that creating huge problems is like a staple of like every story ever, which is just that's one thing that's like a stereotype that I just hate being thrown in these stories. Like, how much of the Harry Potter series would have been solved if Harry had just walked up to Dumbledore and said, "Hey, this is what is happening. I am having evil dreams. Fix it." You know,
there's a great response to that my these guys that I used to know through Sanspants Radio, the Mr. Sunday Movies. He and his co-host on their podcast, The Weekly Planet, they often will watch a film and they have the concept of like a post-it note problem, which is like where a whole film's plot is based on a something that could just be solved with one character writing something down on a post-it note and handing it to somebody else. And just being like, here's the thing you need to know in order to resolve this conflict. And when you have that in a story, you can do it, but you have to really commit to selling the melodrama of it, or you have to make sure the problem isn't solvable with a fucking post-it note. And yeah, you're right. So much of this character drama is like, if all of these grown-ass men just talk to each other, none of this would be a problem. But that's also part of the aesthetic here is Sherlock behaving like a big baby and Mycroft behaving like a fucking a grown-up baby, and then Watson being this like refuses to be ruffled by their bullshit type guy is part of the charm and the chemistry. And so it's like, I think with a bit more care and precision, this could all work well nicely together. But it's just very like slapped together, and like it doesn't have a level of craft to it that I think we would expect for that to be, for me to go, but John would never tell Sherlock that because of this reason, or John would never reveal this for this reason. We don't have enough deep characterization or nuance to be able to make those assertions. And so you're right, it just comes across as like they just kind of don't tell each other for some reason. It's weird.
Yep.
Yeah, good point. Also, John wearing a tie makes him look like a schoolboy, and that's very funny. Just want to put that out there. Okay, so should we move on to case number 2?
All right.
So case number 2, Ian Monkford. Next, Sherlock gets another picture message showing a sports car's front view. He also receives another phone call from a man trapped in a similar position to the woman, who is standing in Piccadilly Circus with a sniper ready to detonate his explosive vest at a moment's notice. This man gives Sherlock 8 hours to solve the mystery. They track down the abandoned vehicle, a small car hired by a banker named Ian Monkford, which is found abandoned at the docks with a blood stain over the driver's side seat. Posing as a close friend, Sherlock interviews Monkford's wife, learning he was recently depressed. Though suspiciously, he discovers Mrs. Monkford might be lying because she is referring to her husband in the past tense, even though no body has been found. Following a card he finds in the glove box, he goes to a local car rental agency, Janus Cars. The owner, Hewitt, claims he didn't know Monkford. Sherlock notes he has a tan and must have gone on a holiday, but Hewitt claims he has a tanning bed. Sherlock does some mind power bullshit to see into the man's wallet to confirm he's lying because he has pesos. At the lab, Sherlock examines the blood samples from the car. With 3 hours left, Sherlock takes John and Lestrade to the car and explains there was exactly a pint of blood that had been previously frozen. He explains that the clue is in the name of Janus Cars. They can arrange for people to disappear, and Sherlock figures that Ian Monk is in Colombia. Given Hewitt had a 20,000 peso Colombian peso note in his wallet, a lot of pocket change, and despite having said he'd not been abroad, his tan line clearly showed he'd not been on a tanning bed, and he kept scratching his arm since he recently had a booster shot, somehow allowing Sherlock to conclude that Hewitt had just returned from settling Ian Monkford into a new life in Colombia, and Mrs. Monkford was in on it as well, given she referred to him in the past tense. Sherlock tells Lestrade to arrest her and then goes to notify the bomber via his website. The booby-trapped hostage is freed by emergency services. Thoughts, feelings, emotions about the Ian Monkford case?
Okay. So, one thing that I thought was really interesting was that it's kind of a running theme for these different cases that Moriarty is giving him, that Sherlock would have not been able to solve any of them by himself. So for this one, if he did not have the cops looking for that car, he never, ever, ever would have found it. And it's interesting that, like, Moriarty calls him and is like, it's okay that you've gone to the cops. I'm not angry at you. I know you had to do that. But the subtext is also, I knew you had to go to the cops because you couldn't find this on your own. It's the same thing with the body by the river later. Like, he cannot find these random locations without this huge force of people out looking for them. Then my next thought, which I'm going to bring up multiple times, is the snipers, because this bugs the stew out of me. I have never seen a bomb vest detonated by sniper bullet. Because there's flashing lights on the vest, there's wires on the vests. It's because they're detonated by remote control. That's how they always work. Mm-hmm. Why would you have a sniper in broad daylight somewhere shining a laser on this dude in the middle of the town square where everyone could see, oh, here's a nervous guy with a red dot on him. Maybe we should call the cops or something?
Yeah. I think I don't know nothing about guns. I ain't a big time American gunman, okay? Let me tell you, I don't know nothing about no guns, but I suspect textually this is trying to set up the idea that Moriarty is always going to have access to a bunch of snipers anywhere, and they're always going to be hidden in plain sight. You're never going to be able to find them. That becomes a key setup for his character later, at the end of season 2. This to me feels like, how do we, on a low budget, communicate that this guy has men and eyes and ears and guns everywhere, ready at any moment's notice? You buy a $5 laser pointer from the corner store, and you say that there's a sniper. it feels like a limit of both budget and creativity for this character, in my opinion. Like, I just think that there is like way more interesting ways to do this. Yeah, it's just not it. Yeah, the other thing is that because I don't know enough about how guns and vests and stuff work and bombs and whatnot, what it does do is mean that at the end of the episode, when Sherlock points the gun at the vest, I go, oh shit, it's going to explode when he shoots it. And then we cut to credits. So for me, as a guy that doesn't know nothing about guns or bombs and whatnot, it communicates enough for me of how these mechanisms might work in the universe that I'm going, oh fuck, something's about to go down when we do that hard cut.
Okay, so I can go on and talk about this here since you already brought it up, but I think that the only thing that the snipers are introducing is just unnecessary extra added tension, because especially with that last scene that you just mentioned that like emphasizes this point so much, Moriarty would have died just as much from a bullet to the brain as from the exploding vest. So it is no added threat for Sherlock to, move the gun from his head down to the vest. It doesn't matter. Either way, Moriarty is still in just as much of a threat. Just like, flip that around, Sherlock and John are in just as much of a threat from the bomb that could be blown up as they are from the sniper that could shoot them. So the only thing that the sniper adds is that we could visibly see the laser twirling back and forth and knowing that someone's finger is on the trigger that entire time. So if you take away those lasers, there's like literally tension lost from the scene. The tension is not from the actual bomb, it's from the sniper, which is really odd to think about. It's like they introduced one threat and then recontextualized the threat into something else. And I don't understand why they went with this. And the snipers are so prevalent in every single shot. You always see the red laser. While the people are crying because there's a bomb on them, you see the red laser. So you start focusing more on the gun than focusing
bomb.
on the bomb. And I don't understand. Because in every other show, in every other movie, it would have just been the bomb will blow up and kill them. That's all the threat you need.
It makes it about the hostage and not the threat of the explosion. Right? Like, it draws your attention to, like, this person's going to get shot versus this person's going to blow up in a way that's weird. Because you'd think that it's in a different show, you're right. The threat of a bomb going off would be like, holy shit, this is going to cause a lot of casualties. But here, because of the sniper, like you're saying, I was more focused on the hostage needs to be saved sort of thing.
Yeah, I guess it does recontextualize the danger from mass casualty to single casualty.
It took a bit of the dramatic tension away from me, because like I was less focused on the collateral damage and more just like, well, is he going to save this one person? Which just like detracts from the dramatic tension, I think.
Well, so no matter what explanation we put on having the snipers, because you're right, I never thought about how this could be the introduction for why they are important later on. But I just don't know that they were important enough to add in the extra confusion when the bombs are the primary threat in every single... Anyway, I've got many other notes about the snipers throughout this because I just kept getting confused as to what it was adding in. But anyway, something else I thought was interesting when Sherlock was talking to Mumford's wife, and we find out that he's able to immediately cry on command and get real tears going. So he spent like a couple minutes like wiping them out of his eyes. And I just thought that was so interesting that this character who does not understand human emotion can emulate human emotion like that.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? Also, seeing Benedict Cumberbatch cry, not good for me. Bad for my mental health in general. Just bad to watch, man. Feels bad. If you don't remember this, go back and watch that scene. It's unpleasant to see him do that. I don't know why. He just seems like that man's like a reptile, and he just should not have that in his repertoire. You know what I mean? Feels bad. Don't like it.
And then you already said it in your little review, but I had written down that the cash in the wallet was another example of Sherlock's superhuman perception, because the audience has zero chance to identify that there's anything in there, and there's just the tiniest corner of the bills that are sticking up out of the wallet to be able to see. And then when you see a close-up at the very, like, the end of this solve, and you see a close-up of it, and it looks completely different than what we even see in that shot. The whole, so many of his deductions are just shown oddly. They could have been fine, and it was just shown oddly to the audience. You know, it could have just been, like, all this whole time we've been harping on it, it just might be literally just the director of photography just did not get across what the writers wanted him to get across. It could have been that simple.
Well,
the prop department could have had everything they needed. You know.
Yes, they subsequently, following this, develop and lean on the technique of these snap close-up shots with macro lenses, where they get the objects really close to the sensor, and you get a really high depth of field view of that object for a few seconds, or like a split second, as it's being described, and then they also will play a sound effect that goes along with it. Now, this works really well in some scenes where you go, oh, like, Sherlock made a connection that I possibly couldn't have having looked at that. And in other scenes, it becomes incredibly condescending where, you know, a character will be writing something on a napkin, and they show you a close-up of the napkin and play a pen writing sound, just in case you forgot how a fucking napkin and a pen works, you fucking idiot. Like, they try and solve this later and make the show visibly worse for it, and distractingly worse for it. So I just think you're right. The solution here is not changing the solves themselves. It's changing the way that we see them. And indeed, the pint of blood, we just don't have access to that information. The fact that it's frozen, like, how does he get there? It's just little things like that. You know, I mean, in the first episode, we get Sherlock studying the coagulation of blood and hemoglobin and stuff like that. We could have seen a return of that knowledge here to prove that this blood was frozen, but he just makes this claim. And so there's little pieces missing here that could have been the really cool connective tissue that we would have gone, I should have thought of that, because I remember from episode 1 when he made that comment about the way that blood works. I should have seen that when they showed me the blood in the car, and the car, you know, like, you don't get those aha moments here because we just don't get shown it in the right method, I guess.
Now, it might be interesting if you were actually whatever branch of scientist would be looking at this kind of stuff, that we see him actually do the test where he's dropping whatever chemical on the blood, and we see the blood start to bubble, and, like, if you have the knowledge, you might immediately say that was frozen.
Yes.
That doesn't do what you're saying, though. That doesn't give most of the audience members what they need to be able to do the solve. But
that's why you have John Watson in the Sherlock stories. Is he's the guy that Sherlock can explain it to. Because John goes, well, what are you doing? And he goes, you know, let me tell you about this. You could even, I mean, this story has Molly as well, who's a great interlocutor for this kind of thing as well. She could explain what's going on when he's studying this blood. It's just like basic storytelling they choose not to do because they need to get through 5 cases in an hour and a half, and they wasted 6 minutes of Sherlock fucking around at the start. And so they lose precious screen time for these cases that are these interstitial scenes that maybe existed and got cut. Like, right, maybe they were shot where they have these conversations, but they got rid of it potentially, or they chose not to go down that route in service of this indulgent introduction that adds very little. And so you can see this show's priorities starting to reveal themselves a little bit, just in the amount of what on screen is the most amount of time spent doing. And if you're just starting to get into literary theory and media crit and this space, or if you're studying at university, one of the first things you do when you read a text is start to break it into segments and go, what are we spending the most time actually seeing or learning about or listening to? And that usually informs the priority of the text itself, if not the priority of the author. I think this episode's pretty clear where its interests are. And it's not in the solving of the mysteries, it's in the tension of the mind battle between Sherlock and the bomber.
Yeah. Right, that's all I had for that. If you want to move on to
Yeah. We can
Miss
just
Prince.
Let's talk about case number 3, Connie Prince. Now, the keen-eared listener may have noticed that I have very little notes on those 2 previous cases. It's because I was really bored both times when I watched this episode. I found it really boring. Case 4 is when my brain finally kicked in, but boy, those first 2 really bored the shit out of me. So case number 3, Connie Prince. That's also because I've seen this show like 8 times. It doesn't help. John and
Just
Sherlock.
to back up 10 seconds before this, because this was one of the funniest things I've seen so far. The close, the transition into the Connie Prince scene is they're talking with Greg in the underground parking lot, and then Sherlock is like boasting, "We're doing it," and then he and John go walking off, and then there's a beautiful transition of all the lights shutting off, like breaker by breaker, so that it's closer to the camera, the lights go black, then the next one, so they're backlit by the lights further down the tunnel. Greg is sitting there in the dark.
Incredible. Incredible.
And I keep laughing every time I think about him. He's just looking around. He's like, who turned off the lights?
It's like it doesn't cut away, and a few seconds later his like phone light comes on. Guys. Incredible. Also, shout outs the weird technology in this episode. I'll talk about it in a second, but when we get to case number 4, but there are some like real like 2010 ass fucking little gadgets and gizmos in this that when we get to it, I'll talk about it a bit more. But there's some stuff in this, like those light breakers, where I know how that stuff works, and like that is a thing that you would do in a space like that. Wouldn't happen these days. They'd all be on the same breaker because you have much better transistors, and you get much better depth of length on those pieces of technology. We have way better fuses. But there's some stuff in this which like that is a really great dramatic like way to transition a shot. And that is very funny to me because I did not think about that, but now it's all like that's all I'm thinking of. It's a little
yeah, and just think about like for the actors filming the scene, like they tell Benedict and what's John's name?
Martin Freeman. You keep forgetting his name every time.
I do. I don't. It's like I don't like the dude, but anyway.
Well, yeah.
So Benedict and Martin go walking down. They're like, okay, all the lights are going to turn off. Keep going straight. And don't run into anything.
Don't walk into the DP standing 10 feet behind the camera. That also means the crew are in the dark as well, which is very funny.
Yeah.
Another thing we should say is that a shot like this is hard to accomplish without really, really high quality sensors on your cameras. So one of the things that the show is going to start to do is experiment a lot more with this stuff now that they've got these really expensive lenses. So we're going to start to see like a lot more of this kind of creative scene transitioning as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so case number 3, Connie Prince. We'll do this one and then we'll take a quick break and then we'll round out the episode. So John and Sherlock go out for a meal and John wonders if the bomber is Moriarty, the mysterious employer of the killer cabbie. Sherlock's phone rings and someone sends him a photo of a woman with 3 Greenwich pips. Sherlock has no idea who she is, but John recognizes her as Connie Prince, a fashionista and makeup celebrity from TV. John turns on the TV as an elderly woman calls to relay a message that his new hostage is blind and Sherlock has 12 hours to solve the case. Sherlock and John turn to the television, which is announcing the death of the television makeover artist Connie Prince, who died recently from tinnitus after cutting herself on a hand with a rusty nail. At the morgue, however, Sherlock shows that the wound was clean and was made after her death. John interviews Connie's brother, Kenny Prince, and decides he murdered his sister by infecting her cat's paws. Holmes demolishes this theory and instead blames the housekeeper Raul DeSantis, who committed the murder by injecting increasing doses of Botox. Although Sherlock has solved the puzzle before the deadline, the bomber triggers the explosives when she starts describing his voice as being soft. The blast kills the woman and 11 of her neighbors, with the bombing once again being staged to look like a gas leak by the British intelligence. And Sherlock admits that while he solved the puzzle, he still lost this round, which I disagree with. Sherlock explains that Moriarty is some sort of crime consultant who normally does not get himself exposed. John accuses him of relishing the challenge when lives are endangered, and Sherlock replies that being unemotional makes him more efficient, which in turn saves lives. So I think this case is where the Sherlock's mind powers stuff really becomes like annoying to watch. This is where I was first visibly annoyed by the way that he solves stuff. John's conclusion makes sense, is provided so what the show does is the text gives us all of the information we need to make the solve, just as John makes the solve. John makes the solve, and we go, oh, cool, I was almost there. What a cool solve. Good for John. Then the show goes, no, fuck you. Sherlock solved this with information you didn't have access to from a single look at one episode of a TV show, and then he decides the solution to the case. And boy, it really, like, I felt it this time. I was like, it was, like, I felt the condescension for us, the viewer, being brought in through John's point of view. It felt like the writers being like, haha, dummies. You thought you could solve this one? Nah, Sherlock, you too dumb for it. Sherlock's a big smart guy. I really felt that this time. Maybe that's just me, because I read these texts in such a way that I kind of always work out what they're going for, and this really felt like a real slap in the face, frankly.
A really big issue that I had with this episode is that Sherlock solves it, assumedly from what we could tell, he solves it really, really quickly. Like, he sees the Botox injection points, like, right when he examines the body, so I'm assuming at that point he already has a very strong idea, because he immediately rules out the cut being the infection point because of how new it is, in regards to the incubation time and all this kind of stuff. So I'm pretty sure that as soon as he inspected the body, he knew how she died, so then figuring out who it was just going through all those blogs later on. But the part that I have such an issue with is the entire reason that he brushed it off was so that he could get a head start on trying to solve the next one, or try to solve who the big criminal is. So why did he waste all of the time going along with John's plan, getting the stupid cameras, going there, doing all of that drama that he knew was pointless? Like, that had to be like multiple hours of time to get a camera and drive out to this place and then drive back and get back into the action.
He didn't get any information from that journey. He already had the solve before he arrived. John literally calls him out on it. He's like, dude, what the hell? You knew this before you came here.
Yeah, so like that entire scene doesn't have a point aside from making John look stupid, and then by comparison making the audience look stupid for thinking, oh, John's onto it, this makes sense. So it just the entire thing doesn't it just should have been cut and done differently. I don't know.
Yeah. I also found the actual scene work really hard to watch here. Like, the tone of this scene with both John's interview and then Sherlock coming in and doing the photography and stuff, I just found it really annoying to watch. Like, it was overly produced in a way, and I know that's what it was going for. It was like, aren't they being irritating? But off the back of feeling like feeling like the show was about to tell me I'm stupid, it only added to how irritating the actual sequencing was. And watching them do this farcical runabout while we're in the middle of this, like, high tense countdown thing, mind battle with Moriarty, like, it just felt stupid. Like, it's just dumb. Like, this is just silly. And I use the word silly very literally. Like, it's silly to watch. This feels like a cartoon moment, not a moment in this Sherlock show.
Yeah, and then, like, the brunt of the joke the whole time is the brother who was not the villain and is mourning his dead sister,
who incidentally again is gay. Like, what the fuck are we doing? Like, it just do you know what I mean? It's like, what is this? What, like, this is the second time this has happened in this episode, where it's like, queerness is inherently associated with some kind of, it's always adjacent to criminality in some sense, at least textually so far. We'll talk about, when we get into season 2, we'll be talking a lot about queer baiting and the way that this begins to affect the way these texts are read by the audience. But yeah, I just, it sucks, man. It's like the brunt of the joke is the guy whose sister is dead, and also us, the audience. Like, who is this scene for? This scene is for the writers, not for the audience.
The last note that I had on this section was at the very end of it, the hostage is killed because she starts to describe Moriarty's voice to Sherlock.
Mm-hmm.
And that explanation makes absolutely zero sense, because he would have already interviewed every hostage who would have described Moriarty's voice. So nothing about this makes sense in universe at all.
It's also
unless he is not doing those basic detective things like we said earlier.
I don't think he is. Right? Like, he's not doing that. We don't see that stuff. He doesn't talk to any of the victims after they're saved. I guess because they have the next case immediately. But he could have used that extra 3 hours that he bought himself by solving the case early to go and do that, potentially.
Yeah.
But also, the hostage's death is also disconnected from the theme of the episode. Like, the idea of Sherlock delaying the solve is his hubris is what's going to get him and John into danger later. The fact that he thinks he's smarter than Moriarty. The hostage dying is of her own volition. He doesn't tell her to start describing her. So the reason she dies has nothing to do with like his fundamental flaw that he needs to try and overcome that is being revealed in this episode. Like, they're just not related at all, which is the other weird thing here. It's just, it also adds nothing. Like, I think it's just supposed to be shocking because she's an old woman who's blind. We should feel bad about that. Like, I think that's just a shock. It's a shock value thing.
Yeah. And then there's one just really odd thing to me was that they make a big deal and have like multiple lines of dialogue centered around the fact that the villain behind this is someone who is paid to be a consulting criminal. And they make out like it's some big revelation, but that was the entire point of the first episode. They've already had this revelation once, and now they're having it again, and I don't understand why.
I don't get it. It's cool. Oh, okay, so it's cool. I think this might be another like little Moffat thing. I think the idea is that this is cool because in the original stories, Professor Moriarty, right? One of the key things about him is that he is a really educated man who has students that follow him. And that's part of what makes him really hard to get to, is that he knows everybody because he's this big time professor guy. And so like all the angles that Sherlock would normally attack are not available to him because this guy is so well connected. I think it's trying to like reinterpret that in a way where it's like, okay, but if he's a consulting criminal, he would have similar kinds of connections that make him hard to get to. But the reveal here doesn't, like, I think it's the reveal of the wrong thing. I think the reveal here that makes sense is something more about, like the nature of his, the nature of his position in society or his connections, or like, I think what should matter here is what makes him so threatening and dangerous, not that he's a consulting criminal. Like, more reveals about that would be where I would focus on, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
Giving us more about the depth of the penetration of his ability to corrupt anybody and have access to any resources. Like, you know, he could they could conclude that he's learned something about Sherlock and Watson or the police that there's no way he could have known unless he has a man on the inside, kind of thing. Like, there's more intrigue to be had here than just revealing that. I certainly agree. The only other thing I did have on this before we move on is the loss of this hostage doesn't change the rest of the plot or the way they deal with it. And I was sort of waiting for that to happen. I was kind of waiting for it to come back, but it just never really does. And so I'm not sure if that's something that they were intending to pick up later or not. But I just thought that was odd that this isn't a meaningful thing to occur. This is an incident to be brushed off for its shock value.
Yeah, because it would have been a very it would have tracked really well with the other stuff that we see, where the cops come in and say, okay, someone died, now we have to take over.
Yep.
Like, and then now Sherlock has to do the rest of this by himself.
Yep.
That would have tracked really, really well. But it's that death has no implication for the rest of the story. There's what's the point of it?
Yeah, it's a very nothing way to end the scene, just to shock us and be like, oh, things are getting serious, instead of things getting serious and then having consequences. So that the outcome is put before the cause, in a sense. Do you have anything else on case number 3?
Well, that's it.
All right, we might take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about case number 4, and then the real meat of this episode, which is going to be the kind of climactic moments with the bomber as they reveal themselves. So we'll be right back. Give Up After 3 is a production of Zero Indent. We are an independent publication entirely funded by readers and viewers. If you like the kind of stuff we do, you can head to zeroindent.com to find more articles, works that we do, and different projects. Or if you want to support us for as little as $1 a month, you can head to patreon.com/zeroindent. This kind of podcast and production takes a lot of time and research and a lot of reading and aggregating information, and putting it all together takes time as well. And with your support on Patreon, it helps us justify doing more of this and making even more weird shows. So head over to patreon.com/zeroindent if you can afford to support us. If not, consider telling a friend who you think might enjoy this. Send them a link, see what they think. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of this episode. All right, let's talk about case number 4, Alex Woodbridge. The 4th piece appears as a photograph of the River Thames. Sherlock sets out to the scene and comes across the corpse of a man there that the police have found. After surveying the scene, Sherlock starts checking internet records. John examines the corpse and concludes he was asphyxiated and dead for 24 hours. Sherlock explains that the water has destroyed most of the data, but the lost Vermeer painting, recently discovered and valued at over £30 million, is a fake. Lestrade has no idea what he's talking about, and Sherlock explains that the victim was killed by the Golem, a Czech assassin who strangles his victims with his own bare hands. The victim himself is wearing heavy-duty pants and looks like a standard-issue uniform. There is also a clip on his belt for a walkie-talkie, and his legs show that he apparently does a lot of walking and sitting, allowing Sherlock to further deduce the man is a security guard. Further examination revealed ticket stubs in the victim's pocket, indicating he worked at a museum or art gallery. The Hickman Gallery, where the Vermeer painting is located, has reported one of their attendants, Alex Woodbridge, as missing since about the same time the corpse is presumed to have been dead. The gallery is showing the Vermeer that night, meaning Woodbridge must have been killed because he was aware of something that would have stopped the sale of the painting. Therefore, it's a fake. Sherlock sets off to find the Golem, while wondering why the bomber has not contacted him. Sherlock has the cab pull over and goes up to a pier. He gives money to a homeless woman and tells John that he is investing, and then goes on to the gallery. When he gets there, he sends John to check out the attendant's flat and then heads inside. We then have 2 kind of parallel scenes. John gets the attendant's address from Lestrade and talks to his roommate, who mentions that Woodbridge was an amateur astronomer, but didn't know anything about art. She says someone left a message for Alex and plays it back. It's Professor Cairns, a local professor, calling to tell Alex that he was right. That's all we learn. Mycroft calls and asks if there's any progress on the missile plan case. Back at the Hickman Gallery, the owner, Mrs. Wenceslas, notices Sherlock disguised as a security guard and is analyzing the Vermeer. She insists it's not a fake, but Sherlock insists that even if he cannot prove it, he knows she's lying. That night, Sherlock meets with John, who explains that Woodbridge knew nothing about art and was an amateur astronomer. Sherlock is more interested in the woman he gave the change to earlier. She slips him an address and then leaves. They go to a seedier part of town, and Sherlock explains that he has established... Fuck. I can't believe this. Sherlock explains he has established a homeless network and pays them for information. This is taken as a thing that happens and we're never going to question it again. They notice a tall, skinny, balding man, the Golem, but he gets away in a car before they can catch up to him. John, however, knows where he's going. Professor Cairns, meanwhile, is running a video of a planetarium. The Golem murders her, but John and Sherlock arrive and take chase. John draws his gun and tells the Golem to surrender. They have a bit of a scuffle, and though Sherlock and John fail to save her, the garbled astronomy presentation plays during their arrival and gives Sherlock the clue he needs as to what makes the painting a fake. In the last minute, as the time is counted down in front of Mrs. Wenceslas, the Van Buren supernova, which appeared in 1958, could not have been painted in the 1940s and stops the bomber from detonating the bomb. Then he insists that the woman tell him who she bought the painting from, and then she says, yeah, it was from Moriarty, but I never met him. So we at least learn that like Moriarty is the person that helped her organize this cover up. So it's kind of like there's a lot going on here, but there's also absolutely nothing going on here, and it makes it a really complicated one to talk about. So the scene on the beach is where I want to start, where Sherlock kind of just ignores Watson and Lestrade until John has to be like, okay, just like stop being a dick and tell us what's going on. Like this should be a fun little banter moment, but I honestly just found it annoying after the previous sequence. Like it just rubbed me the wrong way again, and I think maybe I was just soured by being told I was a moron by the show, and then this, I'm like, okay, I guess I'll try and care about this case. Yeah, do you have any notes on this case? Because mine are pretty much more about the ending of it with the golem and stuff.
Well, it's possible that they may have intentionally played that sequence differently than they normally would with less banter or whatever, because Sherlock is still pissed that he quote unquote lost the last battle. So it could be kind of hinting at that he's more focused now and he doesn't care about doing the explaining or whatever that he would normally do because he doesn't want to lose this one too. I don't think the writers were going for that. I don't think they were, but it's possible. So I didn't have too many notes, but one of them, Sherlock murmurs a word which I had to look up, which was meretricious, which is one of my new favorite words.
What does that mean?
Apparently attractive, but in reality having no value or integrity.
Huh.
So
cool.
it fits so many things in such a, and it's just a fun word to say.
Meretricious.
But
That
yeah,
is
I
a
don't
good
remember.
word.
Yeah, I don't remember what in the world they were talking about, and Sherlock just says meretricious, and then kind of moves on, and I'm like, that was another one where subtitles didn't help me. I had to go to the script, then I had to go to Google, then I had to look. So anyway,
good rabbit hole. Good word though.
Yeah, now we got a good word. So the golem was one of the more interesting parts to me about this. Like, I love how they built up the villain that he was supposed to be, but physically I don't know if they portrayed him in the right way, because they kind of just went with tall man scary.
Yeah, real tall man scary, big hands.
Yeah,
scary.
Like I did a little bit of digging into the actor, and he's played a couple of really interesting parts, and one of them was, like, he was the big, huge alien in Prometheus. And when they did that, like, they built him a bodysuit, so he actually had muscle to him. Because whatever, genetic condition this dude has, he is super tall, but he is, like, skin and bones. And I'm sure he is, like, wicked strong, because when you're that size, you are for some reason, you're strong, but he does not look threatening. And my comparison was and this is jumping back in time, but like Jaws from James Bond. Like, the dude was wicked tall, but he was beefy. Like, he actually looked intimidating, whereas looking at this guy, he's like gangly, and he looks like he is like a spider or something. That just it's something unnaturally and creepy about him, but not in the way that he would have been. He's supposed to be a world-class hitman, and he doesn't look the part. And then he also doesn't really act to the part either, because, like, they make it known that he has to hide out in the sewers because he's so obviously recognizable. For a world-class hitman, he has to hide in the sewers everywhere he goes. Like, there's so many things that doesn't make sense about this character. So,
I have a theory about the golem, which is that at this time, in this era, a movie that's about to come out is going to be The Dark Knight Rises, in which Bane, played by Tom Hardy, is this villain. He is this, like, physically intimidating force of fucking nature. Like, you watch Tom Hardy in that film, the first time he punches a guy, you feel like he's going to punch through the guy's chest. Like, he just has this physical presence. And his on-screen gravity, it's like, you just cannot not look at him when he's on screen. He's so fucking intimidating. And it feels like this is the budget version of, we needed somebody who was a big tough guy, but we couldn't find the right mode for this story for that, because the people who are going to fight him are going to be John and Sherlock, and they can't fight a big tough guy, can they? They're just these skinny twink boys. Like, so you have to try and find a way for it to be visually unique, but then also not such a threat that we can't imagine that they would be able to fight it. Because, like, Tom Hardy's Bane would demolish our soft boys immediately. And so you kind of have this problem of, if you want to have a physically intimidating villain, how do you do that with characters that aren't themselves physically intimidating, unless you go down the route of building up a character like Robert Downey Jr.'s Sherlock, who is a physical combatant who is very capable because he wields his, you know, his intelligence to do so. And we just don't see that with either of these, with either John or Sherlock. You know, they're not making this fight with the golem isn't an exacting melee where Sherlock's making clever plays and stuff. They just futz about and try and knock him over. Like, this is not they're not capable fighters. And so I think, yeah, I suspect it was probably a case of, if you did anything to make him more intimidating, we would not believe that they had a chance in hell. Is how I read that.
And it may have been what we've said a couple times before, that the writers were working backwards, and that what they wanted was this really weird, unique bruising on the victim's face, and then for Sherlock to see it and recognize, oh yeah, that's because this guy has hands that are 12 inches long, and those are his fingertips that we actually see. So it could have been that's where the entire thing started from, and then they had to figure out, well, how do we make this huge 7-foot tall bad guy fit into the story?
Possibly. I mean, also the invention of this character is like so when we were talking before about the other cases, and we were saying that one of the problems with the solves was the way that they were shown, or the way that we got the evidence to make those solves. This solve that it's this golem character is so utterly tonally not a detective story thing to do. Like, Sherlock just invents a serial killer in order for this to proceed forward. Like, he just conjures one up out of thin air. He's like, it's this person. There's not a way in hell that an audience member can look at that body and be like, this was probably a really tall guy, serial killer type. The thing is, they've done this before and given us the right information. In the first episode, or the second episode, I can't remember which one it is, Sherlock determines someone's height based on, and I was thinking about that in the actual story, sorry, it's in the first story. Sherlock determines somebody's height with their footprint, and he determines a killer by the size of the footprint, the angle of a blow based on the murder weapon, and he works out roughly how tall and how much weight the killer would likely have. And so and this guy's in the mud. So I was expecting this scene to do something similar, where he would look at the footprint in the mud and the way that the guy had been hit, and then start to do that calculus and be like, oh, this guy's really fucking tall. And as he's doing the calculus, we could have been making that solve ourselves. But instead, he just invents the evidence, invents the solution, and the solution is a serial killer we've never heard of. And that, to me, like, the reason I bring that up is I think it's worthy to take a slight aside and just talk about, like, at this point, what genre is this show? Like, is this a detective story at this point? Or is it not a detective story at this point? Because half of the way it frames this stuff is, like, we're interested in the clues and how it leads to the evidence. And the other half is Sherlock inventing stuff for the sake of moving the plot forward, or for the sake of making him look smart. And with the combination of the previous sequence where the show calls you dumb for trying to solve the murder in a murder mystery story, combined with this where he invents new evidence, it made me go, hang on a minute, like, what is this show now? Like, it started as a detective story, but what is it? So I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk really briefly again just about genre, which we have done before previously. So let me just locate that in my notes so that we are in the right section. All right. So when we talk about genre, I guess, Sherlock is going to change as the show evolves and warp into different genres throughout the seasons. But I guess as a season, now that we've kind of wrapped it up a little bit, what genre is it going for, and how does that conflict with the aesthetic stuff we've been talking about? And so in this endless quest to explain art, which is like a thing that the Story Grid has been doing for a long time, Steve Pressfield and his gang over there, Sean Coyne, they basically have this concept called the Story Grid, where they believe that stories are somehow scientific, and if you can just like titrate it all down to like equation-based stuff, you can write perfect stories. But one of the things they do really well is they identify key kind of components of genre, and these key components of genre tell you as an audience member what to expect when you watch something. And so one of the articles is by Rochelle Ramirez, where she talks about the following list of genre requirements for a crime story, right? And so I'll just rattle this list off, and then I want to ask you the question, Darth, like, what do we think the genre is of this show? So these are just these are really top level list from Ramirez. 1, the protagonist is actively trying to solve a crime or puzzle, right? Actively trying to solve it. Tick. There is a MacGuffin driving the story and the investigation forward. Big tick. Who's the bomber? There are investigative red herrings. Big tick. The bomber. All these hostages, all these different cases. Why did he bring up that old case? The antagonist makes the investigation personal to the protagonist. Tick. Right. That first case, and then he threatens John at the end. There is at least one shapeshifter or hypocrite character capable of directly impacting the protagonist. Tick, we get Jim Moriarty at the start, who comes in and then shapeshifts later into the villain. There is a ticking clock. The protagonist has a limited time to solve the crime or puzzle. Big tick, we get a literal ticking clock. There is a physical threat of escalating danger for the protagonist's mental or physical health/safety. Big question mark. So one of the things that makes crime stories interesting and that makes Sherlock interesting as a concept, is that John and Sherlock are always trying to solve these things without getting killed, basically. We see that with the Golem, where, like, their life is in danger, and later on we see this idea of, like, the concept of Sherlock Holmes is threatened. But, writ large, this ticks a lot of the boxes we would consider it for it to be, a successful crime story. And yet it doesn't seem to care about the crimes in its story that much, based on what we just talked about, these two cases. So I don't know, like, what do you think so far as a season, genre-wise? Like, are you reading this as it's still a crime story, it's still a detective story, or is it becoming more of this, like, drama kind of thing? Where's your head at as we kind of move into the end of season 1?
I don't really know what to characterize it as, but I think that the primary thing that this show focuses on is intelligence. That's what it seems to be so focused on, and all of these different interactions with the different people, or the interactions with the actual mysteries and everything, it's just different forms of examining Sherlock's intelligence and showing how that's different, or Moriarty's intelligence, or the woman's intelligence, and the cabbie's intelligence. Is examining everyone's intellect and showing how it's different from the other people in each episode. And maybe that's why the details of all of the mysteries just don't matter as much to the writers, because the whole thing is like a character study with the primary focus of the character being their intelligence. Whereas with some characters, the primary motivation might be their seductiveness, where we see them going around and seducing women, or we might see the primary focus of the character is they're focused on their job and the stuff at work, or whatever. So it seems much more like it's a drama character piece centering on intelligence, with the detective stuff being kind of a vehicle that they're wrapping all of that other stuff up in and pretending it's the main thing. But
Yes.
it's not.
So it's really interesting you say that, because that's exactly where my research led me. So this era of television is full of this stuff, right? Monk, Veronica Mars, NCIS, Criminal Minds, all of these shows, The Mentalists, they center somebody as like a central detective figure, and it's about that detective figure's psyche. So I want to read you from a quote from Elizabeth McNeil, no relation to me, I checked, where she's writing about the epidemic and the invention in this era of these stories where they have crime solving in them, but some of them end up being more about the characters solving the crimes than the actual cases they're solving. So I'll read you an extract from her, which I think is perfectly aligned with what you're saying. Quote, several papers bring to light the development of a detective figure that increasingly eclipses the murder case itself. The sections Detectives on Television and British Detectives and in Different Contexts spotlight the following characters in detective roles. Dr. Gregory House from MD, Adrian Monk from Monk, FBI Special Agent Dale Cooper from Twin Peaks, Fritz from Cracker, James Bond from the decades-long series, and Sherlock Holmes in the post-colonial literary rewrites by Jamyang Norbu and Vishal Rajan. On the whole, the anthology's side-by-side treatment of detective characters offers an intriguing opportunity for analysis. Most of these men undoubtedly tread the line between genius and madness. Where Monk and his severe OCD embody the trend of the detective as analyst and analyzed at the same time, Fitz recognizes the evil capacities within himself in order to solve the crimes. For those who don't remember, he basically thinks like a killer. To continue. Cooper, on the other hand, knows that the key to solving Laura Palmer's murder is encoded in a supernatural dream, and House is institutionalized for a Vicodin addiction. In this way, the detective and his condition, or crucially existential condition, are at the center of the narration. End quote. McNeil, 2015, page 3. If you haven't read this book, I really, really recommend it. I'll link it in the sources. It was really instrumental in my pre-reading for this series. But it's exactly what you said, right? So the center of the story becomes the condition or the existential condition at the center of the story, and in this case, the condition is intelligence. And so the focus becomes the condition of the detective rather than the thing that the detective is solving. Now, in her paper, McNeil goes on to defend House in some detail, where House still very much is invested in the cases for the majority of its runtime, with drama layered over the top, and then kind of calls out other ones for going in different directions. But I think McNeil hones in on a single question that we should ask ourselves at this point, which really folds this stuff out and this focus into why are there so many problems, or why have we identified so many challenges in the formal apparatus of Sherlock? Why does doing this sometimes make the show actively worse? So, quote, "The question therefore arises, is it still detective fiction if the detective is placed in a position of greater significance than the case or the detective tradition itself?" End quote. And this is the real question, I think, at the heart of this show, and it's part of what we're going to get into when we talk about the theory crafting, when we get to Moriarty in a second, is does it make it not a detective story because it's not doing the thing that those stories do, which is center the case that's being solved, right? McNeil's assertion clashes with Ramirez's idea of the genre convention that we talked about, where she has this checklist, right? McNeil's assertion is that the Venn diagram here is leading to a question, which I'll put plainly to render all of that together. Should BBC Sherlock be the center of the story, or should it be about the stories he interacts with? And that becomes the central push and pull of the show moving forward. Is this about super smart, sexy guy Sherlock Holmes, or is this about the crimes he's solving? And like you said, it is definitely about Sherlock, but it keeps pretending it's the other thing. That's where I think it gets itself into strife, and that's where it starts to condescend to its audience and do all these things and become really challenged aesthetically, and challenged to at a structural level. Is it keeps insisting it's an old school detective story because, if you just pay attention, you'll solve the crimes. The creators are constantly saying, our show is complicated, there's all this hidden depth to it, there's all these rugs to pull, you just don't understand it. The text itself is self-deflationary, constantly saying, no, you don't understand why Moriarty did that or why Sherlock did that, but there's a reason. If you just paid enough attention, you'd work it out. And so it kind of wants to have its cake and eat it too, in a sense. Is my conclusion from this first season, is it wants to be this contemporaneous exploration of this detective psyche of Sherlock, focus this idea of intelligence, and then pretend that it's doing this other thing. And in that clash is where we get scenes like Sherlock telling the audience they're stupid for trying to solve a murder in a story about murder mysteries. And that's how you get to that, I think, at a formal level. At the very least. So that was I just wanted to titrate all of that together into that question. And so at this stage, and we'll revisit this at the end of each season, I think, should Sherlock be the center of the story, or should it be about the stories he interacts with? How are you feeling at the moment? Where are you leaning at this point?
I mean, this kind of goes back to something we had talked about at the very beginning, and it may have been in our introduction to episode 1, was if just because this doesn't adhere to the basics of a detective story, if it is in fact a drama that focuses on the characters, does that necessarily make it bad? And I keep going back and forth as to whether, because another way to look at that same question is what if it is a detective story and they frame they build the story in such a way that the audience never has the opportunity to solve the crime, which you had said to you is a huge part of a good detective story, is that the audience has to be able to solve it alongside of the protagonist. But at the same time, should that be a baseline for detective stories? Like, does it have to be that the audience is able to follow along, or could it be that the detective is so far above us that we have no option of following along? That doesn't stop making it a detective story necessarily.
Correct. But it raises the question of, is that enjoyable as a user to engage with? Right? If we're talking in the context of what Dr. Rohn was talking about before, of the way that a user engages with a text, is that enjoyable as a user in our mode of engagement, which is we are watching the puzzle pieces fall into place? Is it enjoyable to not have the ability to even have half of the pieces when that's most of the screen time is watching him solve this case? There is an argument to be made that, okay, I love these characterizations. The chemistry is great. That's what I'm here for. I don't give a shit about the mysteries. And for some readers, that will satisfy their userly engagement with this text. And so some people might say, yes, that's enough for me. What I think is deeply interesting from a historical contextual perspective, which is what we're going to talk about in about 30 minutes when we get to the end of this episode, is why in this particular instance did this apparatus, which is what we're saying, this balancing act between should it be about Sherlock, should it not, why in this particular instance did that lead so many people to the conclusion that it actually was a detective story that made sense, and such that they endlessly spent hours and hours and hours trying to make it make sense for the show? And the answer is, I think, because the text in itself insists that it makes sense, and then the authors insist that it makes sense, and they insist that it's a detective story. And so I think the central question becomes, what is the consequence of this mode of storytelling that they're engaging with in constantly saying, no, we promise this all makes sense, we promise this makes sense? What is the outcome of that? And the outcome of that is scenes like we just talked about before, where we try and solve it along with the show, and then the show goes like that and tells you to fuck off. And that's just not an enjoyable way to engage with the text, in my opinion, at least. Now, you might say, but that was cool. I thought it was awesome that it pulled that rug on me and did a 180. And that's perfectly a valid reading. And we're going to get to some of those readings later in this series, particularly around season 3, where some people are going to say, I like when the show thinks I'm dumb. And that's a perfectly valid reading to have. I think it's a little psychopathic, for being honest, but it is valid. And so these are really important questions to ask of this text at this juncture, because of the way this episode ends, and what that does to the internet discourse. So yeah, I just think I totally agree. I don't know that there's a definitive answer to this question, but it's one we should keep asking ourselves and ask of the text. As a side note, there's a clue here where this guy's wearing a digital watch with alarms on it, and I showed this to one of my colleagues who's like 19, and he did not believe me that we used to have digital watches and you could set alarms and like that they had all these utilities. He didn't believe me. He's like, but you would have just used your phone. I was like, well, my phone didn't have an alarm. He just couldn't. They just could not. It was very made me feel 1,000 years old. So if you're watching and you remember digital watches, or if I even have an analog watch I still wear, there you go. Now you feel old. You're welcome. I
want to throw something back into that last, because I can't remember if I brought this up when we were talking about that before, about the different ways of interpreting the show, and how some people might not care if the show is talking down to them like this one tends to. And it's something that I've talked about a lot before, is the idea that the viewer, there's two different types of viewers, and you're either watching to engage or you're watching to disengage from reality. Mm-hmm. And this show is much more geared towards people who want to disengage from reality. They don't need things to make sense. They don't want things to make sense. They want to be distracted. Whereas what you are preferring is the detective show that engages you, that is not an escapism where you have to bring in real life stuff to make what you're seeing make sense and to interpret it and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. So that's just an interesting thing to add in to that entire discussion, is not just what does the text say, not just what did the writers want to portray, but who is the viewer and what state are they in.
Yes, and that's a really critical question that we will keep coming back. And when I'm so eager to get into this, when we talk about the historical context of this show, who the viewer is becomes a really central question to the show's existence. Like existentially, it becomes the focus of the show. Who is this for? Who cares about this? Right? That becomes a real focus. And we will see some stuff later on about sexuality and coding, particularly in the next episode, that will pretty definitively say who the show is not for. And yet those people continue to watch the show, continue to engage with it, and be mostly the core audience. So the show has this problem at its heart, which is that the people it attracted were the nerds like me who were like, well, this all has to make sense. There's no way that they just did this shit and it is condescending. And the writers are like constantly lying to everybody, saying, no, it all does make sense. It's this great detective story. And we believed them and stayed engaged, despite how many times in the text they tell you that you're dumb for trying to solve the cases before Sherlock. And so there is a mode in which the story is almost conflicting with its own message constantly in order to try and tell you to stop paying attention. But in a way that some readers then interpret it as the writer's trying to throw you off the scent. We'll get into some crafting about that later, theory crafting and stuff. But yeah, I think you're right. Who is this for is a really central question. And who should be allowed to insist that their reading of a text is correct. And this becomes the focus of Tumblr as a fandom, right? Fandom is the terminology that ends up evolving through this, where if you don't agree with certain fandoms' viewpoints on a particular part of the text and their interpretation of it, you're not a real fan. Or you fall into a camp of fandom, where you start to get these divisions among audience and user engagement, where some people have decided on a particular userly engagement, and then others have decided on a different particular userly engagement. And then they argue about that, and they contest them, and it changes the way they read the text. And it's a real interesting thing that starts to happen, particularly next season, that is going to become central to the core question of this show, which is like, why the fuck did anyone think there would be a final episode that was going to make the show not bad the whole time? And this question that we're talking about right now is the start of that, like, forensically. I think if we were talking about a murder mystery, this is the body we've just found on the floor, Darth. Okay, the end of this episode is the death of the idea that Sherlock was ever going to make sense, and we're going to work forensically back from that and try and find out how it happened. Okay, so do you have anything else on case number 4, or shall we talk about Andrew West and then the climax here?
Just real brief. When they're in the sewers or something arches is what they called it, where they found the golem, and this is such a weird filmmaking decision that they did. They come around the corner, and then John pulls him back and says, oh, look, it's him. And then you see the golem stand up, and you see his shadow cast on the wall, and it's huge and intimidating and all of this stuff. But you cannot identify a person by a shadow, and the shadow does not show the size of a person unless you know the distance of the person to the light source. Like, there's so much about how that scene was filmed that makes zero sense. And then to top it all off, the golem runs away and jumps into a waiting car. So... like, none of that scene makes sense once you stop to think about it.
I also just don't know why it's in there. It's just filler, It's just filler. They could have just gone straight to the planetarium. Yeah,
they may have just really, and this is a thing from a filmmaker's point of view. There have been a lot of shots where I'm like, I will have this shot in my movie because this location is awesome.
Yep.
Maybe someone really liked those tunnels, those arches, and they're like,
Paul McGowan went to his DP and he was like, listen, we're going to this fucking sick-ass little tunnel I found and we're shooting a shot there, okay? Like, that may have happened, you're right.
The really funny thing, though, is, like, I went and actually, like, Googled that to figure out what this place is, and it's like a club with like fancy TV screens and seats for an audience members, and I'm like, I don't know what they showed us, but when you Google it, it's not the same thing whatsoever.
Wow, that's weird.
So I don't know if they just used the name and they thought the name was cool.
Possibly.
But
that's weird.
Anyway,
Okay.
And then the last thing I had already kind of mentioned, which was that we see when they're fighting inside the planetarium, we see Sherlock shoot a gun, which is just not something that we've seen before this episode. And then it also just really hit me. I found it odd how he shot the gun. When he is up in their apartment and he's shooting, he actually looks moderately practiced and moderately comfortable. He never, if you'll see some people shoot, they'll rear back because they're afraid of it. They'll blink when it goes off and all of this stuff. And in the planetarium, he looks super uncomfortable to me. Yeah, like granted, he was just in a fight and he's on the floor and there's blinking lights and all this stuff. Maybe that was what they were going for, but he looks so uncomfortable with a gun when at the beginning of the episode, he was so comfortable with a gun. He was doing all of this stuff and shooting behind his back. So those two scenes, and then compare that with the very end where he is so comfortable with the gun. He's got both hands up. He is super confident, and none of this meshes together. So
yeah. See, it's interesting that you notice that stuff, because I just don't have the attention to that kind of detail, because I just don't think about guns ever. And so that to me is interesting in that I don't think about guns ever. That sounds like an indie band. But like it's that stuff is interesting, because it's like that's the director or the actors making decisions or not making decisions that have like slight consequences in that context.
Well, it's really interesting as we've been delving more and more into stuff, and I'm just seeing like the difference in where I don't know if it's to say where we place value or if it's just what we observe. And like I am so practical in the stuff that I tend to point out, and it's a lot more with like what you would see on set for filmmaking or that kind of stuff, and you're much more of like the theory behind this or the meta stuff that you have to go 12 layers up in your intellect to figure out, and I'm like dirt on ground. I'm like very
You're like, shoot dirty, seem bad. I like to think that you bring a certain groundedness to this show, otherwise it would just be too academic to follow. I also part of the reason that that I think it makes for a good counterpoint, though, is that you represent more closely a typical reader of this text. Whereas I was the reader of the text at the time, and now I have gone like so far back around that I am now studying it that like there's no way that my reading of this is relatable to a regular reading. I can anticipate what it was and what it most likely is based on the context, because as I'm doing this, by the way, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, I'm reading through Tumblr blogs from the time of people talking about it. I think I've read upwards of like 200 pages so far, as I follow each episode and read what people are posting. People are going to start live tweeting these episodes, and I'm going to probably follow along with those as well. But it's interesting to see the way that readers are engaging with it is very much in the mode of kind of what you're doing, but more of the like detective style, like, well, there must be a reason that John did that or Sherlock said that. And they start to sort of craft as they go, I guess. But yeah, I don't want to jump the gun too much. I want to talk about Moriarty first, and then we can talk about that. So case number 5, Andrew West. At Sherlock's behest, John is investigating the Andrew West case on his own and examines the crime scene, where he learns that little blood was found on the tracks. Sherlock appears behind him, confirming that West was killed somewhere else and dumped on the roof of a train. He then fell off when the car experienced a slight jolt. Subsequently, they break into the apartment of West's prospective brother-in-law, Joe Harrison, who is a bike messenger. They find blood on the windowsill of a window overlooking a railway line. When Joe comes home, they confront him about the murder and theft. Joe breaks down, confessing he stole the Bruce Parlington data because he started dealing drugs and got into some debt. One night, he went out with West, who boasted about the secret plans while they were drinking. Harrison stole it from his drunken brother-in-law, but when West realized it later and confronted him, West accidentally died in the fight when he fell down a stairway. Joe then had the idea to place him on top of a train to get the body as far away as possible. While a train was stopped underneath the window, Joe rolled West's body onto the train roof, and the train pulled away. The body then fell off from the sudden jolt of the passenger car when wheel axles hit the switch points. Harrison turns over the memory stick, and Sherlock says that the distraction is over. He tells John that he has returned the memory. Sherlock tells John that he has returned the memory stick, and waits by the pink phone while watching John describe. While watching, what have I written here? Oh, well, what John describes as crap telly. So Sherlock's watching like sitcoms. John goes out to meet Sarah. Sherlock then contacts Moriarty, offering the missile plans where they can meet at the swimming pool, where Carl Powers died. When he arrives, he is greeted by John, who at first appears to taunt him, but very quickly reveals he is wearing an explosive vest and is having his words dictated to him like the previous victims. The red dot of a laser rifle sight floats on his chest. Do you want to talk is there anything about Andrew West's case that you want to discuss before we get to the good stuff?
No, the only thing that I had was just that this is one of my favorite murder cover-ups because of the simplicity.
Yeah.
I just really, really liked it.
It's clever. It's practical. You can work it out based on one of the opening shots of where their apartment is. It's really clever. It's so simple. Well, it's a good way to hide a body as well. Like, it's practical in real life. If I need to hide something, put it on a train.
Disclaimer. Okay, disclaimer to the audience members. We are not held responsible.
If you do a murder and put a body on a train, this show is not legally liable. However, if you wanted to do that and it was a good way to hide a body, we're not going to stop you. We're not going to say don't do it. I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm just saying that if you did, it wouldn't be our fault. Yeah, it's a weirdly grounded, cool little just normal murder thing at the end of, off the back of the insane golem thing and then the ridiculous like housekeeper thing. It's just a nice little like simple murder, which is cool because it's also it's supposed to be this big like espionage style. How did the plans go missing? Oh my god, British intelligence is at risk kind of thing. But it turns out to just be like a simple debt problem that someone got too out of hand kind of thing. It's neat. Okay, let's talk about the good stuff. Let's talk about the last 10 minutes of this episode. Moriarty finally appears and turns out to be Jim Moriarty, Molly's pseudo-boyfriend. The volatile and clearly unhinged Moriarty throws the USB stick in the pool and explains the whole point of the exercise was to show Sherlock what he's capable of. In desperation, John seizes Moriarty, shouting at Sherlock to run. Moriarty finds this highly amusing, calling John Sherlock's pet. Within moments, another laser sight appears on Sherlock's face. John then releases Moriarty, who warns Sherlock to stay out of his way, threatening that he will not merely kill him. Quote, "If you don't stop prying, I'll burn you. I'll burn the heart out of you." End quote. Okay, so I'll talk about the resolution to this in a second, but what do you think about Andrew Scott's portrayal of Moriarty?
Oh, that is one of my favorite villains of all time. I absolutely love it. I wish we got to see way more of this character throughout the rest of the series. I'd love it, and the dialogue is so over the top, but I have that filed away as threats I will give in real life if the situation ever occurs, because it's beautiful.
His delivery. I mean, Andrew Scott is he's just ended up playing a bunch of roles as a big skis bag, and he just nails this so well. This is a good opportunity to... for those who haven't watched the show, Moriarty here is this sort of flamboyant, aggressive, erratic, kind of scattered characterization. I'll describe it a bit more in a second, but I want to bring up a concept that I think is really important for this show, and just understanding the aesthetics of Sherlock, which is the concept of affective register. So affective with an A. So affective register refers to the mood and attitudes of a character and how it defines the range of expression and behavior they can perform. So for example, if we're talking about affective register, Sherlock yelling at everyone to shut up is really within his affective register, right? Him telling a room of people to shut up, he's thinking, while Sherlock saying something like, I love you, is really outside of that register, which means it draws attention to the exception, right? So affective register, the thing that is important to understand about it is in fiction, it helps us predict the behavior of a character that basically layers their characterization over time. This is kind of a psychoanalytical understanding of characterization where how a character's affective register is comprehended by a reader is how we recognize them as a simulation of a real person. The fact that we can kind of predict how John Watson might respond to a jab or how Molly might respond to a taunt helps us develop an internal sense of this character. So effective register is really, really important because what it gives us as a reader is the ability to begin to construct a consistent idea of this character. You can start to list off a series of like traits that Moriarty has and traits that Sherlock has. It's how we like understand people and character. And so Moriarty's effective register is of a very particular era as well. This sort of over-the-top, chaotic, like extreme affectation takes a lot of the inspiration of what was happening at the time, which was kind of the Jokerification of villains, for want of a better word. If you Google that word, you'll find a bunch of really good papers where the extremity of their villainy has to be reflected in the extremity of their register and behavior. So the idea there is that they are so capable of evil and malice, and there's so much better and smarter at this than you are, that it overcomes them and bubbles up and overcomes their ability to express themselves. They're so villainous that it seeps into their very being and the way they talk and behave and act, and creates this register. And the where this kind of comes from, the history of this is kind of from Bond villains to an extent, where they kind of draw on a lot of the cartoonish villainy of westerns and animes in particular, and that's all sort of an interrelated cycle, right? The Seven Samurai type stuff, the Kurosawa films influencing anime, and then anime influencing modern sci-fi and stuff like that. It's all kind of this loop, but it's really exciting to watch. It makes for great performances where you put a character actor in these positions. You think of Silence of the Lambs, think of Heath Ledger's Joker. You just get these like larger than life villains, right? But it has this challenge to text that it presents, which I think is really interesting, where it means that these characters can only exist in certain registers, and they can't do what is called like mode switching, where characters can have one register for one type of scene and then they mode switch to something else. So an example would be John Watson has a mode switch into from bumbling kind of everyman into like military hardman in that first episode, where he picks up the gun and he stops shaking, right? He goes into kind of action mode. One of the problems with a character that has this strong of an affectation, in particular this kind of Jokerified affectation, is it becomes impossible to imagine them doing mundane tasks. Like, you can't imagine, it's hard to imagine Moriarty grocery shopping or paying for a parking fine. We can do it, but it really stretches the limit of that register. And so what it does is it limits the space in which an author can render and observe, in which an author is likely willing to render this character, and in which we as the reader will observe them. So you get this limited liminal space where the text has to go, Moriarty can kind of exist doing these things, and so we must make the most of those things. This isn't like I'm not criticizing the text or saying it doesn't work. I just think it's an interesting and crucial theory to acknowledge, is the only way to change that in a text without completely breaking a characterization is to work on it over time, right? So really slowly alter a character through development, additional characterization, events that change them, or backstory, where we learn, oh, actually, that is something that they're capable of because X, Y, Z happened to them previously. Think of Bond in Skyfall, right? That James Bond, previous to this, seemed like a meathead who didn't have a lot of emotional depth, who really struggled with the loss of Vesper. Skyfall gives us a lot of his childhood backstory and allows him to become a lot more emotionally complex when it comes to M and their story there. And so a characterization like Moriarty is compromised by the fact that the text can only do this amount of stuff with him, like they can only do this amount of things with him, and they have to make the most of it. So this leads into a challenge the show has, which is he is also very camp, and he's coded here as being specifically sexually attracted to Sherlock, right? He has the victim refer to him as sexy. This comes up again and again in the text that Moriarty wants to do the fuck with Sherlock, which by itself is not a problem. It's a textual change that is like, could make for a curious twist, right? I think, like we kind of touched on earlier, the challenge arises from the way that his queerness and villainy seem inherently interrelated. And it's largely because we don't observe queerness in any other context in the text prior to this, nor do we necessarily observe Moriarty engaging in a register either outside of being really camp and crazy or being very threatening. So like even when his register isn't this camp kind of loosey-goosey, even when he's yelling and he's like, I'll burn the heart out of you, his textual motivation and attraction to Sherlock are his central motive. Like he is just fucking around doing crimes, but over the course of the next season, his entire raison d'etre is going to become dismantling Sherlock and fucking with him. And so, as a character, he can no more escape his queer coding than he can go grocery shopping, right? You know, per Alexander 2019, which was sort of where I'm pulling all this from. And so a lot of readers at the time, and I won't speak on behalf of these particular readers. What I will do is instead convey what they had said themselves, and then we'll examine an argument from a prominent YouTuber, Sarah Zed, next season, who gets into the nitty-gritty of this. But a lot of readers consider the show being very guilty of queer baiting, and we'll get into that, like I said, next season. But here's just a bit of a taster of... I think this term gets thrown around a lot in literary theory, and particularly modern literary theory, where... people will describe a show or a text as queer baiting, and then the response to it is, well, that's just the SJW agenda kind of thing. And it's actually, queer baiting is not inherently negative necessarily. It describes a mode of text, and it's similar to any mode of text, right? Lampshading, cliffhanger, all of these are literary mechanisms and devices. They aren't inherently positive or negative. And so I just want to read you a little bit of a taster from an essay that we're going to dote on a little bit next season. Just a definition in this context of what the frick do we mean by queer baiting, so that when we talk about it next season, we have that laid out. So, quote, according to Judith Fallahaller, queer baiting may be defined as a strategy by which writers and networks attempt to gain the attention of queer viewers via hints, jokes, gestures, and or symbolism, suggesting a queer relationship between two characters, and then emphatically denying and laughing off the possibility. End quote. So this text has two key relationships it constantly and relentlessly queer baits. That's the Sherlock and Moriarty pairing and the Sherlock and John pairing. And because the text never legitimizes either, what it ends up doing in a later season is it actually legitimately writes two jokes about this, where it and it's to do with, I won't spoil it, but it's to do with an incident where the show tries to explain how Sherlock survived what should have been a lethal incident, and it literally makes fun of the idea of either of these two pairings happening, where one of them makes, it makes fun of Sherlock and Moriarty hooking up and getting away with this lethal moment together, and then it makes fun of Sherlock escaping it and going to be with John. It thinks it's funny that people think these could be couples. And so when we talked before about the way that users are engaging with this text, whether or not it's a correct reading to go, I want these characters to be in a relationship, or I read their sexual tension there, or I see, whatever that is, it is observable that the show is coding these characters this way. It is saying these two pairings, it is within the text that there is suggestions of it. I think it's one of those things that, like, unless you deliberately read against the text, it's obvious it's there. I just wanted to provide that without criticism or commentary, just in its own right, because I think it's an important thing that people and scholars in this space have written a lot about, and we'll refer to Sarah Zed's content about it next season, because hers is really sort of enlightening on this. But it is just like, it's a thing that's being talked about. And when we say the historical contextualization is important, this is a thing that's happening on Tumblr. People are saying, man, wouldn't it be cool if these two characters got together? They start to do fan art of these pairings. They start to do, fan fiction about it. This is what's happening on the internet at the time with these shows. They're pairing these characters with other characters, right? They're having Sherlock meet Doctor Who, Matt Smith's Doctor Who, and they're becoming a couple. The Super Who-lock fandom, which is Supernatural, Sherlock, and Doctor Who. There's all of this interpollination of these fandoms, and a lot of it is centered around how often these shows will queerbait different characters, and then people who would like to see more representations of queerness, realizing the shows aren't going to do it, and so writing it themselves. With Supernatural as the obvious exception, where one of the characters, relentlessly queer-baited, gets to have a moment where that queerness is validated, and then the show dismisses that. But at least it's in the text. And so I just think it's important to acknowledge that, like, one of the consequences of this effective register and this particular characterization is the tendency for the show to keep doing this and not feel any responsibility to not. Which is also weird because, like, Andrew Scott like it seems oddly insulting to him, as someone who has talked about his sexual orientation before, to have the characters constantly be queer baited like this is the other thing. But yeah, just wanted to set that table work for next season because it's going to be important.
It's kind of interesting though, because right when he first walks in, and he says something like, "It was so fun playing the part of Jim, playing the part of the IT guy, pretending to be gay." So then I'm sitting here thinking, like, all these times that he's flirting with Sherlock, yet he just said he was pretending to be gay. So is this the same thing as where Sherlock is not necessarily physically attracted to Irene, but it's more of an intellectual attraction? Is that what we're supposed to see between Moriarty and Sherlock? And then something else that you said that I'd never thought of before was how a character like the Joker can get so locked in to the craziness that we can't imagine them doing simple, ordinary things, and it just hit. That's why Ben Chang in Community, so much of the crazy stuff that he does is in there for no other reason than because we can't see him do anything normal. And the scene that immediately popped into my head was Shirley and Britta are sitting there watching him eat, and they're making fun of how he's using his steak knife like upside down.
He's like yeah.
Yeah, and then they're like, and then he's eating the gristle, and it's like no one would normally do this stuff. It should be so cut and dry to watch this dude eat his lunch, but it's not, because he's crazy and he has to always be crazy.
Yes.
And it's like the Joker has to always be crazy, and Moriarty has to always... And so that was just really interesting to think about how many of these characters, and it probably is the same way from the protagonist perspective too, that they're locked into these certain things, and they can't really deviate from that.
It's interesting to use Ben Chang as an example, because this is where like someone like Dan Harmon as a writer is schooling every one of his contemporaries in how you do this stuff, where he writes a character like Benjamin Chang, and then Benjamin Washington Chang, which is still the fucking funniest joke, who is a Spanish teacher. And Ben Chang is insane, like he's properly nuts, and yet, like you say, we see him in normal modes. That affective register stays with him. But it bleeds out in those moments into these bizarre behaviors. Like watching him teach a Spanish class is hilarious, because he'll be talking about a concept and then just start screaming at a student, or he'll drag someone while they're sitting in their desk out of the classroom. Like it stays with him the whole time. And Harmon's commitment to and his control of these affective registers is part of what makes his shows so enjoyable to watch, right? You think about the final season of Community and how well he introduces a character like Frankie and Elroy, who are these new additions, and how instantly they have their own affective register that's unique, and they feel like they've been part of the show the whole time. And as you know, if you want to talk about people that are doing this stuff well, Dan Harmon is like obviously the standout in our contemporary space when it comes to television writing, because he just fully understands how to commit to this stuff and see it through, and never really flinches. And I think a lot of the time, Sherlock in particular flinches when it comes to this stuff, particularly around Moriarty and his sexuality and how that interacts with his affective register. There is a lot of gun shyness here about, if they just did it, if they just committed to what they were going for, it would be great and make for a really good show. But, and this is one of my favorite quotes from Moriarty, and from Moffat even, and I'll make sure I source this in the notes, where he talks about when he takes over as Doctor Who's showrunner, he talks about the idea of, he had 2 opportunities to cast a woman and didn't. And he said, I always wanted to cast a woman, and that would be really exciting, casting a woman in that role. But, Doctor Who's a show for everybody. It's for, people on the left and people who also voted Brexit. And so Moffat knows the mysterious connection between people that might have voted Brexit and people that maybe wouldn't be cool with a female doctor. He knows that he is queer baiting. He knows what he's doing with Irene Adler and Sherlock. This is not a fucking accident that this stuff is in the text, right? We have fucking conclusive evidence multiple times that this stuff is being done on purpose, and yet it never and yet it is still left as, that queer baiting, because he never works out how to write that affective register in a different context. He never works out how to write a believable Moriarty who could kiss someone, right? I just said that, and a few of you listening went, that is really hard to imagine. Like Moriarty making out with someone is hard to imagine because we just don't get enough. There's not enough of a box for him to be written into, right? Like the width of his behaviors is so narrow that it's almost impossible, like you said, to imagine them in those other contexts. And I think it's always impressive when a writer can do that and do it well. And yeah, I mean, Dan Harmon's a fucking genius. But certainly, yeah, it's one of those things that you, unless you have studied the stuff, you don't think about it until someone points it out, and then you go, oh my god, like that's why Jared Leto's Joker sucked to watch, because they have him doing all of these things that don't fit the effective register, and it just doesn't work. He's sitting at a nightclub talking to a crime boss about shit, and he's doing the effective register of Jared Leto's Joker, who wouldn't do that. He would interrupt a meeting, or he'd do it over a pile of money that he set on fire. Like, there's this disconnect between the context of the behavior and the effective register, and so it can go the other way too. But yeah, this stuff is so like fascinating to me as text. So, do you have anything on the threats and stuff before we talk about how the episode resolves?
Pretty much. I was looking through my notes, and pretty much all my notes in this scene are like really like practical stuff, which just trends with what I had said before. But the first thought that I had was that the entire scene setting didn't make sense to me, and I wish they had done it a little differently, of having Sherlock be the one to turn on the lights in the pool. Because it made zero sense to me that this is a 24/7 pool, which is not a thing anywhere that I'm aware of. So someone went in there, turned on the lights, and then left it for these guys to have their confrontation. And it just kind of took me out of the scene once I realized how little sense the scene itself actually made. Mm-hmm. And then I thought it was, I don't know if this was like just me being an idiot, but when I first saw this, I thought John was supposed to be Moriarty the whole entire time. That he had like split personalities or something.
Oh.
And I like completely missed the fact that he had on the same coat that all of the victims had that was covering up the bomb.
Yeah, I missed that too. There's a few seconds where it had me. And
then that led to another silly American moment when John says, "This is a turn-up, isn't it, Sherlock?" And for the past however many years, I have thought that he meant the turned-up collar on the jacket.
Oh my god!
And so that coat was called a turn-up.
Oh my god!
And so then,
my god!
Today, when I was watching this, and I was like, "Wait, maybe that's not what he meant." So then I googled "turn-up," and apparently it just means this is a change. This is a surprise. So
if that isn't proof that the American education system is broken, I don't know what is. A turnip. I was dreading for a second. You thought it meant turnip, like the vegetable. You're like, is that a British expression? This is a turnip. Like, Jesus. Yeah.
And then I had the same thing with the snipers that just bugged the stew out of me. That like it wasn't just one. They had like I think there's 4 different sniper dots that are on Sherlock's chest at one point. Because it's not enough that they have the bomb. It's not enough that they have one sniper. It's they have to keep making the audience more and more nervous for his safety. So now we've got multiple snipers all watching Sherlock, which does nothing. One bullet will kill you.
Yeah.
It's just added tension.
Done
And yeah. And then if you think about how the scene was filmed, all of the snipers were actually behind Sherlock's head because, well, anyway, they were all behind him. Then we want to see when John takes Moriarty hostage and wraps his arm around him so the bomb is right there. One of the snipers runs around the pool to get on the other side, so then he could put he could put the laser on Sherlock's chest instead of his back.
Yep.
So that way the audience can see it. But just you picture the sniper literally had to run around the pool.
Which is funny because the stands go all the way around, so he would have just been running at the top level of the stands the whole way around.
Yeah,
which is very funny.
And then and in none of the wide shots do you see anyone up there either. So like everything to do with the snipers, I am just enraged with, and I wish they had done something different. Because in any other film, Moriarty would have been holding a dead man's trigger, and he would have said, "If you shoot me, my thumb comes off, you all die." That's how every other movie would have done this.
He also he could have just what would have been cooler is if there's no threat except for the bomb, and he's like he just is he bluffs about it, right? Where he's like, I've got people watching, and if you do anything, they'll blow it up for me. And then Sherlock has to work out if he's lying or not. Like, you could do so much with this, I feel.
Something that really bugged me for a while was how Moriarty knew exactly the model of the pistol in Sherlock's pocket. And I was so annoyed that that was another omniscient point of view thing until I realized that it was literally John's gun,
Yep.
and it was the army issued gun. So if Moriarty knows that John was in the army, he knows what the model gun is. So that's actually a believable solve.
Well, I also think it's believable because John wrote about the Study in Pink case and didn't reveal that he was the shooter. And so you could see Moriarty making that connection and working out what type of gun it would be, is how I read that.
Interesting.
That he's made this solve, like he's worked out that John was the shooter, and that's how he's worked out what the gun was. Because John would have said, hey, on the blog, this is the type of bullet and the type of gun it would have been from. But we never found the shooter. Is one way that I think you could read that.
Something reading into this scene, Sherlock says, what if I was to shoot you right now? What if I was to end this and shoot you and kill you? And I keep wondering if that was what made him shoot Magnuson later on. Because that seemed to come so far out of the blue for him to just blatantly kill someone like that.
Spoilers.
And when I saw this, but when I saw this scene and I was like, what if this was it? What if this was him remembering this moment and him thinking I could solve everything if I had just shot Moriarty then?
That's 100%
So that's why
happening.
So that's why he does Magnuson later.
And it's the same setup, which is like John is in danger.
Yeah,
And that's why he does it.
And if the writers had intended that all along, bravo. I had never made that connection whatsoever.
It's interesting.
So I appreciate that so much more now.
Yeah.
Moriarty's exit, if you watch his first exit, I swear, I will bet money he walks into a changing room and just stands there. Like, we're inferring there's a hallway with an exit door there. It's a row of changing rooms.
I think the physical choreography of this scene is super weird, like you were saying before, because I thought the same thing. I was like, where is he going?
Yeah, they shot it so poorly, and I don't understand why. And they did 0 side shots for some reason. Everything was from like Sherlock's end of the pool, mostly facing the other end of the pool. And I don't know if they just weren't allowed to take equipment around the entire pool.
Yeah,
or
it might have been some kind of limitation of the shooting space, or like, I mean, I can't remember what they must have been. I don't know if they used the Area Lexus for that scene, but they may have physically not been able to fit them in because they were quite big cameras at the time. I don't know. It is weird though. It's weirdly shot, I would say.
Yeah. And then one thing that I would have paid money to see this happen because it makes so much sense for Sherlock to think to this level of detail. When he takes the vest off of John, he just slides it like 20 feet away. It will kill you.
Yeah,
it is not.
You're
not
not safe. You need to get out of the building, guys.
But you know where it would have been way safer?
In the pool?
At the bottom of the pool.
Yeah. I was thinking that.
Like, chunk it in the pool. It should not float, and even if it goes off, it'll just mostly go vertically. It'll get absorbed by the water. All of this stuff. It would have made so much sense for his character to think through that stuff. But they couldn't have that because they needed that big moment at the end with the stupid pointing the gun at the thing because that's more dangerous than a bullet.
Better cliffhanger. Okay, so Moriarty leaves, giving Sherlock a chance to rip the bomb off John and hurl it away. Both men are exhausted and distraught. John kind of crouches against the wall. Sherlock's kind of pacing. John is like, I'm glad nobody saw that, bloody undressing me in a dark pool, mate. Haha. Which is
an awful, not just because of what you're talking about, but this is another example of them ruining John's character from episode 1.
Yep.
He is supposed to get stronger when he's in danger.
Yep.
That's the entire point of his character, but this is another thing showing how he gets weaker when he's in danger.
Yeah. So this scene in particular is so weirdly constructed that, and particularly because it has the cliffhanger, which when we talk about the very end, I want to talk about Moffat's cliffhanger problem. But all the stuff you were saying around, like, why did he do that with the bomb, and what about the snipers and all this stuff? Fans are doing that at the time. They are trying to explain this stuff away. And this episode and the beginning of season 2 is when meta crafting starts to happen. Now, for those who weren't around on the internet at the time, or God forbid those listeners too young to know what this is, meta refers to a constructed set of readings about a text or a part of a text that either change the initial meaning of the text or reinterpret the text to mean something beyond the usual reading. So, for example, a meta for Sherlock might be that Moriarty is secretly in love with Sherlock the whole time, and that's his motivation, like sexually attracted. A meta might be that John and Sherlock are secretly in love but can never admit it, or we never get to see it on camera. Things like Lost at the time. J.J. Abrams' Lost. There's a lot of meta crafting about Lost, about what's happening. Same with Doctor Who and same with Supernatural. So it's a really common thing that's happening on the internet. And so something that fans land on really quickly, and I'm interested to see if you think and notice this, something fans really focused on at the time was the difference between the phone Moriarty and the pool Moriarty. Now, the crux of the theory is that the behavior is really different, where phone Moriarty is very directly sexual towards Sherlock. He calls him sexy and a bunch of other stuff. And then pool Moriarty is a lot more threatening and kind of villainous. And one of the results of this, and I didn't notice a difference. I just I didn't acknowledge this, but a lot of people feel this way. This leads to a bunch of theories. Some of the more ridiculous ones are that there are Moriarty twins, that there's two Moriartys and they're identical twins. Funny, given the Prestige is going to come out months after this, and that's going to be the solve. It's very funny to me. The others are that Moriarty and Sherlock have known each other all along. The other is that Moriarty's a code name that John and Jim share. But I want to read you one in particular about this Tumblr, from Tumblr, about this scene, this pool scene. Attempting to unpack... I want to read this because I think it's emblematic of what's happening online. For us to read these texts, it's really important to acknowledge the insane things people are crafting around them, these insane metas they're developing. So this comes from a user called a Sherlock Study. Now, this post is from 9th of December 2015. It's about 3 years after this episode. And this is really in the height of this fandom. Now, the crux of this theory is that in this moment, or in general, Moriarty is picking up on the subtextual sexual tension between John and Sherlock, which is his motivation for agreeing to go to the pool. So I'm just going to read you little sections of this post, and then I want to get your response to it. So the first section is this, quote, "In other words, the whole point of the scene was that Moriarty warned Sherlock to stay away from John, but that he reckoned it was too late because John and Sherlock were already in love with each other. Jim realized that things were probably already irreversible, so he came back at the end to put an end to all of it." End quote. So that's the theory of him coming back in, is that he's realized these two are already in love and that there's nothing he can do about it. So, and this is, I think you'll fall out of your chair, okay? This is them explaining why this happens from a character motivation perspective. If we think about effective register and all of the stuff we've talked about, this is bringing all of that together into one tight little package here. Quote, "Jim Moriarty is actually a very human villain, which is exactly what makes him the most appropriate villain for this show and its philosophy. But the fact that an emotion so powerful and holy as love is the reason of his continuous moral decay makes him the most dangerous and terrifying and fantastic of all the villains in BBC Sherlock. Jim Moriarty has been unfathomably tortured by his feelings for Sherlock and Sherlock's rejection, and so his planned vengeance was frightfully sinister and twisted. If they all died there at the pool, that would be it. But if Sherlock shot Moriarty and the snipers killed John, then what would happen? Sherlock would leave feeling guilty about John's death. Moriarty put John's life in Sherlock's hands. He stood there doing nothing, so that Sherlock would be the only one to cause all of the consequences for John. He literally left him no choice but to kill John." And then he quotes the show, "If you want to kill me, you'll have to kill him as well." End quote. I'll read you the next bit in a second, but what do you what do you think about that so far?
My first thought isn't even about that. It's the fact that I don't understand why we have gotten away from the brotherly bond. Like, everyone immediately jumps to two same-sex characters showing affection for each other. They immediately jump to sexual attraction, and I'm like Sam and Frodo. It's a brotherhood, you know. Like, this is in so many stories, you have, it's usually two men, but you have two men who are so close to one another, and there is not supposed to be anything romantic about the relationship whatsoever. It is supposed to be a brotherly bond, and I don't know where, it's like we've gotten to a point in our society where people have forgotten what that is, and everything must be romantic or it must be platonic, and they can't differentiate. Or...
It's interesting. There's a video by Maggie Mae Fish where she breaks down like what, like, so the thing about queer coding and reading text through like the queer lens is that there is a distinction between text where you are deliberately saying, I would like to imagine these characters as queer. So the Sam and Sherlock example, there's no queer coding in the films to support that reading, right? Like, it is very clearly a platonic bond between them. I think the difference with something like Sherlock and Supernatural and Doctor Who as well is the shows actively introduce that coding and keep readers who like that coding engaged. Like, the show makes jokes about it. They are actively like the thing that happens right during this scene, after they throw the bomb vest away, is that joke that John makes about, you know, bloody pool at night. What are people gonna say, kind of thing. And so while I agree with you that I think there is a place for reading relationships as platonic, it is also hard not to acknowledge the fact that readers have been doing this for heterosexual relationships for text for fucking decades. Like, you watch a detective story where like the good guy is the, you know, roguish handsome guy who's a bit scruffy, and then, you know, the female lead detective, there's always an undertone of sexual attraction kind of thing. This is something that happens in heterosexual readings of text all the time. The challenge we have when it comes to this particular topic and the way that we talk about reading these texts is that I don't necessarily have an opinion either way as to whether this show is queer coding, but it seems to me that enough readers support that it is doing that, and then, you know, the result of that is queer baiting, that when a reader like this comes to it and is crafting theories like this, I'm left asking the question, not necessarily like to your point, like, why aren't we reading things in the way the texts are presenting them? Because in this case, the text deliberately is keeping us on the hook for this. What I'm interested in is, like, this is an effort to explain behavior for Moriarty and Sherlock that doesn't make sense. Like, they are inventing and introducing aspects to this text, you know, we'll call it the meta. They are defining a meta to explain away behaviors that are, the show has explained, don't have to make sense because of the way it's constructed. And so if the show made slightly more sense, or if these characters behave more predictably, I would completely agree with you and say there is no reason to think that this queer coding should be taken seriously and we should read this as platonic. But in this context, like, the show is actively making a choice to not let it happen, like, to not let us get away with that reading, because it's always making jokes about it. So I don't know, that's my thought on it, and that's kind of why this is happening, versus what we're going to start to see in a more contemporary framework. So I'm talking contemporary like now, which is people actively bringing queer readings to texts that aren't queer coded, but acknowledging that and being like, this is a form of academic exercise. This isn't, I'm not saying these characters are in this relationship, but it's interesting to read text through that lens because you gain more as a reader. You learn more about the way that the craft is done and things like that. I think there is a difference between that, which is the academic pursuit of, you know, reading text through a queer lens, and what you were saying, which I think is, I also don't agree with, which is dismissing a text's content in order to make a queer reading that isn't being acknowledged as like something that is sort of, you know, academic. Like, you're saying, well, actually, no, they are gay, and you just don't get it, kind of thing. That's where I really draw the line. I think there's a difference between academically examining it, and then also, you know, deliberately, you know, what we would call antagonistic reading to a text, which is deliberately reading against the text message, which is valid and fine. It's just not my preference for how I read text. But it's a totally valid point. We should talk about that when we talk about next season and Irene, and that whole mess as well. And Stephen Moffat's issue with bisexual women. I'm going to read you more of this insanity if you want, because it goes deeper into this rabbit hole. Quote, so Sherlock would blame himself for his best friend's death because he was the idiot who asked a criminal mastermind for a meeting. And as we learn more and more about Sherlock in the next seasons, I think it's safe to assume that eventually Sherlock wouldn't be strong enough to keep living with his guilt. Be it drugs, be it a gun, Sherlock would put an end to his life. And Moriarty would therefore win because he would burn the heart out of Sherlock and have killed him eventually. End quote. And so the idea here is that Moriarty is so in love and so tortured by his feelings with Sherlock that his plan is to trick Sherlock into causing the death of John, whom he knows Sherlock is already in love with, in order to deconstruct Sherlock's psyche. But then he realizes, as he's leaving, that actually they're already too in love, that I need to go back and just kill them both because it's not going to work. And so you can see this constant twisting and untwisting of like, how do you explain this bizarre choice to re-enter the room? And to put it bluntly, this is a pretty light taste of where this culture ends up going and where these metas begin to form. We'll be talking a lot about less of the queer coding and less of the queer baiting next season, and a lot more of the plot metacrafting, where people are developing metas around explanations for certain things in certain episodes. But I point this out to point out that fans at the time and users and people in that mode of user engagement demonstrate constantly this like urgent need for the show to make sense. Like they are like, this has to make sense because otherwise, like, this all has to mean something because otherwise the writers just think we're dumb. And it's like they are really trying hard to make it make sense. And what this is going to mean is that we're going to start to see these big divisions in the fan base between these different metas. People who support one argument, people who support the other. When we get to the end of this show and we talk about the idea of this final fake episode, the thing that's going to be really important to acknowledge is that by that point, basically no one is on board with the idea that the show, is just bad. Every reader is like holding out hope that it will explain itself away and be like, no, it all made sense the whole time because the authors keep promising it, the text keeps promising it, and the fans continually are engaging in that mode of usually engagement with the text, that it's almost unimaginable to this type of reader that you were saying before, the engaged reader, right, who wants it all to make sense. It's not fathomable to them that the queer coding isn't for real and that these characters aren't going to get together, and that the plots didn't make sense the whole time. Because otherwise, the writers for 4 seasons of television have been adding clues and hints and jokes and hooks about this stuff, and they're not doing it on purpose. And for them, that is so unimaginable that they have to invent this other reading. And so I think we also have to acknowledge and empathize with the reader who is trying to make it make sense because they are trying to justify their engagement with this piece of text that ultimately doesn't care about them and thinks that they're stupid. And so I think I get it. Like, and when we get to that last episode and the finale of the show, we're going to be talking a lot about, it must suck to have been that reader and been in that mode of engagement and have this fucking show just basically get to the end of it and say, fuck you, you dummy. And that's got to be really, really powerfully traumatic for people, the show's core audience who are like, people who are 15, 16, 17, 18 online. A lot of them are, deeply, involved in these queer communities and this evolving internet culture and this fandom. This is a show where they feel they've found some safety and some common ground with being able to empathize with these characters and speculate, and they develop these communities around these metas. And then the way that it all shakes out, it's just like really... it's a really interesting part of the history of this text, and the history of fan reading, because this doesn't happen after this. This is like fandom kind of disappears after Super Hulock era. Like we start to see this move into a lot more of the everybody reads all the text the same way. You see this with, say, like prestige television off the back of this with like Game of Thrones, for example, or Mad Men, where the reading becomes everybody is on the same page about this text. We start to lose a lot of this theory crafting and metas. It does still exist, granted, and a lot of these blogs will continue and do it, but it becomes a lot less of the focus of these communities. And instead, they become a lot more interested in explicitly fan fiction, where they know that it's an alternate universe and it's alternate takes and stuff. And in no small part, it's because of Sherlock. It's because of Homestuck. There's some other stuff we'll talk about when we get to it. But yeah, I also want to just explain the ending, because I don't know if I explained that yet. So suddenly a laser sight reappears on John's chest, and within moments there are at least 4 of them on him. Moriarty reappears and he's like, sorry boys, I'm so changeable. And he has whimsically decided that Sherlock cannot be allowed to continue and must die. Sherlock glances at John, who nods faintly. Sherlock aims his handgun at Moriarty, then lowers it, pointing directly at the explosive rig jacket, now lying nearly at Moriarty's feet. Cut to credits. Which is how the episode ends. Talk about a cliffhanger, Darth. Like, I mean, you talk about writing yourself into a corner. This is such a weird cliffhanger to put in there. I don't know why they didn't just end the episode with him leaving. I mean, I do know that, but what did you think of this ending for the first season? Jesus. You said this. It's a very labored sigh.
Yeah. Backing up very slightly to right before this, because it just bugs the stew out of me. When John's on the floor and he's freaking out, and Sherlock is mildly freaking out himself, and if you watch it, he's gesturing around with the gun like it's a pointer, and he starts scratching his head with the gun. He gestures at John with the gun, and I'm sitting over here internally screaming at him. I am like, you should not be allowed to touch that firearm. You do not know how to handle it. You do not know proper gun safety. This is not good.
I think he just thinks he's smart. He's better. He's smarter than that. He doesn't need to observe it because he's a big genius guy.
He starts like juggling it from his left hand to his right hand.
When he scratches the back of his head, I was like, don't do that with the barrel of the gun.
Yeah.
That's where the bullets come out of.
Oh my.
Yeah, bad stuff.
So the idea that Moriarty just walks back in just like makes so little sense, and I could see why someone would want to try to make it make sense. And then what happens at the beginning of the next season when he lets them live makes even less sense to me. So like this entire thing went from, this is a beautiful scene at this pool at the pool and their confrontation. It starts off so good, and then it ends up with just like question marks all over the place. And ironically, I think that ending it on the cliffhanger like that was the best way to do it and to get excitement going into the next season.
Yes, I agree. But that's the primary motive here. The motive here is to get readers to watch the next episode. It's not to it's not to resolve the episode.
Yeah. And I mean, given the amount of time left, there really was not, they couldn't resolve it properly without much more time spent.
If only there was
because the
6
resolution
minutes
they
could have
was,
used.
Yeah, well, yeah. They probably could have trimmed up a whole lot of unnecessarily stuff throughout this entire thing and had a proper conclusion. I'm not sure how they could have rewritten the Irene phone call into the ending of this one and had it make way more sense.
I don't know, man. I don't know how you... I mean, that's their job, though, is to work that out. And they just chose not to, because this was the way to get people to watch season 2.
Yeah. Which I go back and forth on, because, half of the time I'm like, I know you have to do some things as a filmmaker because it generates interest. And sometimes you have to end a scene a certain way because that's what the audience expects, or blah, blah, blah. But did they need to do this? I don't know.
Look, I think this comes back to... This is a thing that Moffat does all the time in his works. Particularly the shows he runs. It is a real staple of his work, which is... and I've talked about this before, around him adding these little hooks to a larger plot, and then we get the larger plot, and we suddenly get into it, and then it's about to get resolved, and it's resolved with another hook. We never actually get a resolution.
Yeah, I was just about to bring that up, that I have had this argument with multiple people when I'm calling out Episode 7 of Star Wars and how bad it is that it ends on a cliffhanger, and they'll try to argue that Episode 5 ended on a cliffhanger and it's one of the best Star Wars movies ever. And I'm like, it did not end on a cliffhanger. There were 15 minutes of resolution after the fact. Episode 7 had its climax, it had its resolution, it introduced a new hook, like you just said, and it ended on a cliffhanger, which is generally not a good thing to do. Well,
but I wouldn't even say Episode 7... Hang on, which one's... Episode 5. I would say Episode 5 isn't a cliffhanger. It is just... It's set. It's what we call a tag in storytelling. So tags are like short, 3 to 4 minute either teasers for the next thing that's coming or just like additional characterization after the story has ended. It's really common. Think about every episode of Community after you get the end of the episode. There's always some other gag that they do. There's some joke that is unrelated or is related. Like you always get that. Troy Abed's rap is like the one that always stands out to people. Like that moment with the death.
Discoteca.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so that,
but no, so many people don't understand that lacking story doesn't mean something is a cliffhanger. So they argue that episode 5 is a cliffhanger because Vader says he's Luke's father, and that's all we get. They argue that it's a cliffhanger because Han is frozen in carbonite and we don't know where he is. So they are saying that a cliffhanger is just the lack of the full resolution for the full story, and that's not at all the case.
Yeah, by that merit, the first Lord of the Rings film is a cliffhanger because they haven't put the ring in the mountain yet. Like it's just that's text, guys. In text, things don't always resolve, and those loose threads become threads to tug on and start new stories in the next bit of the text. I want to specifically talk about Doctor Who for a second. So at this point, I want to talk about Doctor Who Season 5, where, for those who don't remember, this season centers the mystery of the cracks in the universe that seem to be following the Doctor around. And as the season goes on, they start as background details, and they quickly become central to a handful of episodes. There's the arc in the middle where they used to defeat the Weeping Angels. Rory disappears, through it. So it becomes a mechanism in the season. The climax of the series addresses this mystery directly. How did the cracks in the universe form? That's the central question at the heart of this mystery. Now, I'm going to explain what happens, and I apologize in advance, Grace, if you're listening. I know you love this episode, but I think it's bad. The answer is that I was telling this friend of mine, Grace, I was like, I'm doing this Sherlock show, and I just rewatched all of Doctor Who in preparation, like particularly Moffat's run. She's like, oh man, I really like season 5, and I had to be like, when you get to that, I apologize. So the answer is that the TARDIS exploded, unmaking time and space. Eventually, our heroes stop the universe from happening, and we reset. But there's a lingering question: who blew up the TARDIS and why? The only clue that we have: silence will fall. What does silence will fall mean? Keep watching to find out. Next season, we'll learn the other half of the clue. Silence will fall when the question is asked. What are the silence? I don't know. They're these weird creatures that make you forget about stuff. What's the question that's going to be asked? Keep watching to find out. The Silence are a religious order hellbent on destroying the Doctor and stopping the question being asked. Why are they doing that? Keep watching to find out, you fucking idiot. And so by the time it comes to resolving this long-running mystery, Moffat has twisted and untwisted the story so much that you get this episode on Trenzalore that ends with such a spectacular non-cliffhanger, it's almost unbelievable. The way this ends is that he goes into his subconscious time stream or whatever, sees John Hurt's Doctor, we hard cut to another episode, and we just are in a different context and different stuff is happening. There is no actual resolution for the plot that happens. We just go back and suddenly, Matt Smith is there and he's there with David Tennant, and we have one of the best episodes of the show. But is
that why I can't remember how the Trenzalore episode ended? Because it was so bad that I just
So Clara jumps into his time stream so that she can save him from the silence at every moment in creation. And then he jumps in after her, which brings him into his subconscious where he finds her lying there. And then John Hurt's character turns to camera and it says, introducing John Hurt as the Doctor. And then we cut to credits. And then we open on the Doctor and Clara just doing a normal adventure on Earth.
Why does my brain hurt?
Yeah, it's bad. It's rough, man. The thing I want to point out here is not to dunk on this too much, but rather that Moffat has a tendency to explain a mystery by raising a larger mystery, right? And the larger mystery always has slightly higher stakes. So and what it means is that it's hard to criticize that resolution because you don't know where it's going next. So someone says, hey, Steve, I didn't like the way season 5 ended. He can turn around and say, just you wait till you see what's really coming. And this is part of the formal apparatus that keeps the fans engaged with this text, because it means that you get to theory craft, and then as you get more evidence, you can mutate your theories, and your meta suddenly that part of my meta was validated. Let me go back and rewrite it to adjust for that kind of thing. So what it does do is pay off the interlinked mystery, but so the other thing is that in the Doctor Who scenario, there's this other mystery that's happening at the same time. Sherlock doesn't have this. Doctor Who does. The other mystery is, who the heck is Clara? Okay? Because we see her, she's the Impossible Girl, right? For those who haven't seen the show, Clara is a character who reappears multiple times through time and space, seemingly the same girl, but different, like literally a different person, like has no memory of the previous incarnations. So similar to the River Song setup, this is a cool idea that doesn't ever need to be fully explained, but we will get the full explanation because we have to, because Steve has to explain everything. I don't want to get into River Song right now because we'll be here for hours, but every detail of Clara is explained with a deeply unsatisfying end, right? She goes into that time stream and that's the answer. This isn't because Moffat's writing or executing the explanation poorly, but because a definitive explanation like detracts from the texture of what happens. You know, Doctor Who is fantasy sci-fi, and sometimes it's okay that like, how did Time Lords regenerate? I don't know, it's fucking magic, dude. Don't worry about it. Not everything has to be explained. But kind of like George Lucas, Moffat suffers from what I call explanation-itis, where, you know, Lucas not only provides direct answers, Moffat is like, here is an answer and a self-defeating proposition so that you can't criticize my answer. And it's what we keep talking about. It's deflationary. It's similar to what Andrew Hussey is doing in Homestuck, which we'll be getting into a little bit in season 3. But the thing about the Trenzalore piece that I was alluding to is it brings together these two dissonant mysteries, right? What is the silence? What is the question? And you know, who is Clara, right? They are the same answer, which is Clara is a friend of his who jumps into his time stream to save him at every point in history. What is the question that's being asked? The question that's being asked is Doctor Who, and the answer is the War Doctor, this thing that he's buried. Them being the same answer, like they're resolved the same way, isn't by definition bad. But like we keep talking about, it makes the universe feel tiny. Everything was about the Doctor and Clara the whole while. You know, even under Davies, where there's a little bit of this, the show is about the stories the Doctor interacts with. It's not about the Doctor. He just is there, right? It's him and his companion doing an adventure, and it's always about the adventure. And to the point where, you know, they had these Doctor Light episodes that they used to call, where the Doctor was barely in them. Incidentally, one of the best episodes of the show of all time, Blink, is a Dr. Light episode that was written by Stephen Moffat, and it barely features the Doctor. The Doctor in that show, before Moffat takes over, is just a guy banging about space, solving problems, and growing and changing along the way. Under Moffat, every single season is about some overarching plot that is about the Doctor and the persona of the Doctor. He is the most important person in the universe. And similar to Sherlock, right, you know, Sherlock's biggest challenge is it's all about Moriarty and Sherlock. The first 2 episodes of Sherlock are, I guess, the least offensive, like, you know, literally the least, like they have the least Sherlock in them. You know, he's confined to the tags in that. You know, the tag of those 2 episodes is where we learn about Moriarty's involvement. But this Moriarty stuff starts minor, really smartly starts minor, becomes a central piece, and then the text just indulges itself over and over and over again to the point where every season after this is going to end with a teaser that Moriarty is coming back, and he never does. The final episode of the show does. So there is something happening here formally in Moffat's body of work that this apparatus of resolving a mystery by layering on a mystery means that you have this constant escalation of puzzle, right? It's a J.J. Abrams problem of you find out what's in the mystery box and it's another mystery box. You keep going until eventually you have to end your story. And Moffat can't even do that. By the end of the show, he can't even end the story. He ends with another fucking cliffhanger. And so when we talk about what this is doing functionally, you're absolutely right. It gives the readers something to come back for. What it's doing formally is identifying for us as the users engaging with this text that there is a greater mystery here that's about to... There is something else that's going to happen that we can't possibly foresee. There's some other greater mystery that's going to happen. The stakes are going to get raised. To the point where, you know, the next season ends with a cliffhanger that is then immediately resolved, and then another cliffhanger is introduced. And so this constant twisting and untwisting, every time you do it, raises the stakes. And largely, I think that's why the stories start to get sillier and sillier, and why the problems they're solving are less and less approachable by a human. is that this thing is starting to happen at a formal level in the background. And so what next season when we talk about things being ridiculously silly in a way that we can't follow, started like some of it's starting here, right? This is the next bit of that forensic trail that I think we should start observing, is how these little hooks and these coders are raising the stakes very slowly into a realm that we can't possibly engage with. I just think it's a really interesting formal apparatus, and something that Moffat is in all of his work. Everything he's done does this. And so I think it's worth noting at this juncture. And then we'll revisit it at the end of each season just to see how it kind of keeps evolving.
Well, kudos, I guess, because we've got about 9 hours of footage and we are done with season 1.
Season 1. Very exciting. How do you feel about the season as a whole? Like, because you were real worried that I was going to ruin this for you. Have I ruined it yet, or is that still to come?
I am less enamored than I was when we began. But this also, I feel like, is probably the stronger of the seasons. Granted, I have not delved into the rest of them so far, but as we're seeing the cracks form, I'm just assuming we're going to see more and more and more the further we go. So I'm kind of feeling like long term I'll appreciate these first episodes way more than I will the later episodes.
That's probably true. Maybe that's the meta narrative of this. There's actually no. I'm not even writing a book about this. There is no forensic analysis. I'm just trying to ruin it for you. That's my secret Sherlock plot. Like that's my Moriarty's coming back plot. Is that I'm just trying to ruin this show. No, I tend to agree. I think I was surprised by how much I didn't hate it this time, but fuck, I thought it was boring at certain points. Like that was the thing I was most surprised by. Say what you will, the next seasons are not boring. That's what I would say. As they get sillier and sillier, they become more and more interesting. But maybe that's because I engage with this stuff as craft, not as audience. I don't know. But yeah. Are you...
I was about to say, that'd be interesting to examine exactly why you're so much more interested in it later on.
Because it gets bad. One of the things that I've explained on a few shows previously is that a lot of my enjoyment from text, particularly text I wouldn't normally engage with, is the stuff that I can make off the back of the engagement of the text, not the engagement itself. It's like, for example, when we were doing Art for Artists, we watched a lot of films and TV and stuff. We watched all of the DC EU universe stuff, and those are really bad movies, but I enjoyed engaging with them because of the products and the insights and the craft that we were able to do off the back of it. And so for me, something like Sherlock, my engagement is increased when there is more to engage with textually. It's like in the same way that like I've rewatched the Batman like 3 times now because it's so fucking good, and I keep engaging with different parts of the craft in it. Really good craft and really bad craft are super engaging in this space, and really normal average stuff is just like there's nothing to chew on. And so as a media critic and academic, I'm like, I'm not so interested. But then when we get to silly bullshit shenanigans later on with like super mind palaces and shit like that, I'm like, yeah, give it all to me, Steve. Fill me up, Steven. Even though it does make for a real shit show of a program.
Well, we definitely need to put it on our plate to do a similar review with Community, because so far we're either harping on Star Wars or we've been harping on Sherlock, and I'm like, let's talk about something really good.
I've watched Community like 20 times, man. It's so good. I was also thinking we might do, in between next season, we might do a Patreon bonus episode or something where we watch maybe like the first episode of The Mentalist or something, or Elementary. Because then I was thinking, then at the end of next season, we could do the Warner Brothers Sherlock, like Robert Downey Jr. Like, I think it'd be fun to just some bonus content, cover in a bit less excruciating detail, more of just like a general chat of what we, watch it, what we think of it. I just think that could be a cool little bonus. So we might see about that in our off weeks. But we're going to have a bit of a break. Most likely it'll be about a month between publications of these at this stage. Could be a little bit longer. But yeah, thanks for watching and or listening. This has been a really enjoyable start to this this piece of work. So thank you for joining us on this insane journey. You can find all the stuff we do at zeroindent.com. You can support us at patreon.com/zeroindent. This stuff takes a lot of time to research. I would say for each episode, I'm doing maybe 20, 30 hours of research at the very least. That's not even including consuming text. Like I watched all of Doctor Who season 5 and 6 for this. I watched all these episodes twice, so it's a lot of time and investment. Patreon is a good way to help us justify our time doing this, so you can go support the stuff we do over there. Or if you want to go support Darth, you can find him at YouTube and his Patreon as well, making all kinds of Star Wars content. We have a series that we do over there called That One Scene, where you can watch us do a pretty similar exercise, but in the opposite direction, where we take like a 2-minute clip from Star Wars and talk about it for an hour. So if you're impressed by how we take one scene and end up talking about it for 45 minutes, you'll absolutely love that. So go check that out, youtube.com/Daft with a D at the end. Is there anything else you want to plug, Darth? Any projects you got coming up?
No, I've had a couple music projects that I've been working on for quite a while. One of them just dropped not too long ago, which I have absolutely loved, and no one cares to watch. But hey, that's the life we live. Right?
That's YouTube, baby. That's the YouTube game, baby. Honestly, yes. That's the other thing, is that this stuff is really niche. And so if you know someone that you think would like it, please do send it to them, or leave a review on your platform of choice. That stuff really helps and gets other people who are interested in it, gets their eyes on it. So definitely go ahead and do that. Go follow Darth on YouTube. And we'll catch you next season where we talk about season 2. 3 episodes in season 2, like in season 1. This is the peak of the show's viewership and also the peak of the audience engagement with the show ahead of its escalating and increasing success critically, critically and from a viewership perspective. It starts to really snowball into this huge cultural artifact. And so we're going to be exploring a lot about what the audience is doing at this time, what theories they're crafting, and then we'll also kind of identify some of the key metas that begin to persist throughout the length of the show. And then we're also going to get into some really interesting stuff with, sexuality, Sherlock, masculinity, and a whole bunch of other things. So it's going to be really, really interesting. I'm very excited about it. So join us next season. Otherwise, we'll catch you guys whatever next thing it is you watch. And just remember, don't give anyone any hate for this, okay? I love Steven. I love his work. Please don't go and harass him. That's all from us. We'll catch you guys next time.